Germany of Iron and Blood. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 326. Crushed. Got. Those damned Germans have rushed through our anti-tank trenches. Fire up and stop them. The faces of the Russian commanders changed drastically. Before the battle began, they were full of confidence in their anti-tank trenches, thinking that they would be able to stop the advance of the German armored forces. But I didn't expect that the German army would easily crack their tactic. Those dark tanks are approaching their line of defense and are about to launch an attack. In the absence of anti-tank weapons, it is almost impossible to resist the attack of the German armored forces, only by relying on anti-tank trenches. At most, it will cause some troubles for the German army. Attack. Break through the Russian defenses and crush them all. Colonel Rommel's face remained indifferent. After the outbreak of the Great War, the 8th Armored Division no longer knew how many Russian defense lines it had crushed. This time too, the weak defense of the Russians made it impossible to stop the tanks of the 8th Armored Division. The tracks of the tank will crush everything to pieces. On the Russian army's position, machine guns fired wildly. Dense bullets were fired at the German tanks, but apart from knocking off the paint of the tanks, these bullets could not penetrate the thick armor of the tanks at all. Boom. The tank launched a counterattack. A tank artillery shell accurately hit the firepower of the Russian army's machine gun, blowing it into a pile of scrap iron. The heading machine gun and coaxial machine gun at the front of the tank began to strafe. With dense firepower, those Russian troops on the suppressed position couldn't even raise their heads, let alone counterattack. Under the attack of the German armored forces, the Russian defense line began to become precarious. It seems that it is only a matter of time before it is broken through. The infantry who had been following the German armored forces, also under the cover of these tanks, rushed to a place very close to the Russian defense line. Next, under the cover of tanks, they will break through the Russian defense line and provide protection for the tanks. After all, once one's own tanks break into the Russian army's position, they are very likely to be suicidally attacked by the Russian army. That is currently the only attack method that can pose a threat to German tanks. In the city of Chelm, the headquarters of the Russian army, the atmosphere became a little dignified. This is only the first day of the battle, but it is extremely disadvantageous to the Russian army. This also made the generals of the Russian 4th Army worried. General, the current situation is not good for us. The Germans are attacking very quickly. Their tanks have broken through our anti-tank trenches and are about to attack our forward positions. A lieutenant general officer reported. How could it be so fast? Didn't our anti-tank trenches work at all? Such a result obviously made General Dmitriev a little unbelievable, because he knew that if the German tanks could not be stopped, their defense line would be like paper. General, the Germans directly used more than a dozen trucks to load earth and rocks and filled in 2 passages on our anti-tank trenches. And we have no way to stop this at all, the lieutenant general said with a bitter face. Bastard. Damn Germans, how could they even think of such a tactic? Admiral Dmitriev was very speechless. He felt like he had carefully prepared a punch, but it hit the cotton. General, our outer line of defense may not last long against the Germans. They will soon enter the city of Chelm. This place is no longer safe. General, please evacuate here before the Germans enter Chelm, another lieutenant general said. Once the German army breaks into the city of Chelm and starts street fighting with the Russian army, the generals of the Russian army have no confidence in whether they can win the street battle. Therefore, they hope that Admiral Dmitriev can evacuate here and retreat to a safe place. Admiral Dmitriev wanted to object, but when he thought that his own safety would be threatened if Chelm was caught in street fighting, he swallowed his objection directly. Okay, General Feder, General Golovin, I leave the battle here to you. Although the German tank troops are very powerful, once they enter the street battle, they will definitely be constrained. The narrow streets will restrict the performance of their weapons. Therefore, although the current situation is not good for us, we can certainly resist the Germans' attack and drag them here for the victory of General Ivanov, by enough time. Admiral Dmitriev urged. Although the battle had just begun, he, the commander of the group army, fled, which would definitely have a certain impact on the morale of the troops. But for the sake of his own life, he couldn't care less. Yes, General. Lieutenant General Fiedler and Lieutenant General Golovin nodded again and again. The 22nd Army, over there, I will let them speed up. They will reach Chelm the day after tomorrow at the most. 3 armies, 150,000 people, can withstand the German attack no matter what. Admiral Mitriev continued. Lieutenant General Fiedler and Lieutenant General Golovin also think so. The German army's offensive power is very strong, but if street fighting starts, the German army will definitely not have such a big advantage anymore. They don't talk about defeating the German army, and if they persist for half a month, there should be no major problems. Maybe, they could also defeat the German army by virtue of their strength in street battles. In that case, they have made great achievements. After Admiral Dmitriev explained this, he quickly withdrew from Chelm and retreated to a safe rear. And it was when Admiral Dmitriev withdrew from Chelm that the German armored forces broke through the forward positions of the Russian army. Crunch, crunch. The tracks of the tank crushed the ground and broke through the Russian defense line. Run. The German tanks are rushing up. The Russian army on the ground had already been terrified. After discovering that the German tanks were crushed up, they even ran away. Da. The machine guns on the German tanks started firing, and rows of bullets shot out, knocking down all the Russian soldiers who were trying to escape. More and more tanks broke through the positions of the Russian army. The tracks of the tanks were crushing wantonly on the positions of the Russian army. The fortifications of the Russian army were directly crushed, and some Russian soldiers who did not have time to escape were even crushed into meat paste. Chapter 327, Massacre. Da. A tank that entered the Russian army's position was crazily shooting forward with machine guns. Those Russian soldiers who were running away were easily shot and killed by machine gun bullets and fell to the ground. Blood flowed from them. Flowed out from his body, staining the soil red. Damn it. Who will blow up the German tank for me? A captain and company commander of the Russian army cursed. However, the remaining dozen or so Russian soldiers under his command were already terrified, and none of them dared to go. In their eyes, the German tanks have undoubtedly become the embodiment of death. Cowards. You are all cowards. The company commander cursed. Immediately, holding an explosive package, he rushed out of his hiding place and rushed towards the German tank that kept firing. His company originally consisted of more than 100 people. However, under the attack of this German tank, the losses were exhausted. As a brave soldier, he certainly wanted to avenge his men. However, bravery is a commendable quality. However, when the disparity in strength is too great, blindly being brave is reckless. The Russian company commander was alone with a pack of explosives, and his behavior of trying to blow up the German tank was simply to die. You must know that in addition to their powerful self-defense firepower, German tanks are often accompanied by infantry in combat. Therefore, the actions of the company commander of the Russian army are doomed to fail. In fact, he had just rushed towards the German tanks before he was spotted. The infantry of the German army was specially trained to cooperate with tanks. Among them, there is a special training subject, which is training to protect tanks. Bang, bang, bang. Gunshots sounded, and several German infantrymen accompanying the tanks began to shoot. The bullet hit the ground, splashing patches of dust. The Russian company commander was also very agile, and rolled on the spot to avoid these bullets. However, when he rushed to within a few meters of the tank, a crisp gunshot sounded. Boom. A bullet accurately sounded hit the head of the Russian company commander. His head, like a watermelon, shattered in an instant. When his head was smashed, his body rushed forward a few steps. But in the end, he fell powerlessly to the ground. The explosive pack in his hand also fell to the ground. The company commander is dead, killed by the Germans. Run. The remaining Russian soldiers ran away in a panic. But the bullets of the German army chased them, and most of them were shot dead, and there were very few people who escaped successfully. The Russian defense line was easily torn open under the attack of the German armored forces. A large number of tanks rushed to the Russian position, and began to wantonly massacre the Russian soldiers on the position. They bombarded with tanks, strapped with machine guns, and even crushed with tracks is only one purpose, and that is to kill all these Russian soldiers who dare to resist. A large number of German infantry, following behind the tank, rushed to the Russian position. They use the sophisticated weapons in their hands to attack the Russian army. If you encounter a slight resistance, immediately call for tank support. Rough-skinned and thick-skinned tanks can block Russian attacks. The sharp tank gun can destroy the Russian army. Under the attack of the German infantry and tanks in coordination with this tactic, the resistance of the Russian army seemed so fragile. Flee. The Germans are too powerful, we can't resist their attack at all. Countless Russian soldiers, regardless of the chief's scolding, insulting or even beating, fled one after another, and fled to the city of Chelm. The German army chased after them, constantly using powerful firepower to harvest the lives of these Russian officers and soldiers. This battle can no longer be described as a battle. It may be more accurate to describe it as massacre. Indeed, in front of the German army armed to the teeth, the Russian army is like a group of lambs waiting to be slaughtered, only to be slaughtered by the German army. On the position of the German army, General Eckert and others are paying attention to the development of the battle situation. When they saw the armored troops of the German army break into the Russian army's position and lead the infantry to clear the Russian army from the position, smiles appeared on their faces. General, this battle is too simple. The Russians are the same as before, except that they have dug a useless anti-tank trench. Other than that, there is no heart at all. In front of the armored forces, it is still vulnerable. The commander of the German 49th Infantry Division said, well, the Russians are really too weak. Whether it is weaponry or training, there is a big gap compared with the Imperial Army. In terms of tactics, even flattering horses is not as good as the Empire. Fighting them, there is always the feeling of bullying. Lieutenant General Eckert had a smile on his face. Haha, the general is right, we are bullying the Russians. But who told them to make enemies of the Empire? The commander of the 51st Infantry Division also said with a smile. As the generals of the German army, they are very excited now. As the army achieved victory one after another in the battle, this also meant that they gained more and more military exploits. When the time is right, they will definitely get promoted. Do not want to be a general soldier, not a good soldier. But in the same way, even if they become generals, they also hope to be able to climb further. Order the remaining 2 infantry divisions to launch an attack and defeat the Russians in one fell swoop. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has explained that we should defeat the Russians in the shortest possible time. General Eckert ordered. Qin Tian knew that once the German army launched an attack, if the Russian army wanted to adopt risky tactics, it would definitely attack the Austro-Hungarian army with all its strength. This will put the Austro-Hungarian army under tremendous pressure. Qin Tian also didn't know whether the Austro-Hungarian army could withstand the fierce attack of the Russian army. Therefore, he hopes that the German 8th Army can win in the shortest possible time without wasting any time. Yes, General. The remaining 2 infantry divisions of the German 17th Army also participated in the attack. Their joining accelerated the defeat of the Russian army. Under the fierce attack of the German army, the defense line deployed by the Russian army on the outskirts of Chelm only lasted for half a day before being defeated across the board. In this battle, the Russian army lost more than 30,000 people. Among them, half of the Russian army voluntarily surrendered to the German army after the defense line was breached. The rest were all killed. The Russian army suffered heavy losses, so they had to retreat back to the city of Chelm, using the city to resist the German attack. Although the urban area of Chelm is not large, the Russian army has built many fortifications in the city, trying to use street fighting to attack the German army and delay time. Chapter 328, Destroy the City. General, the Russians have retreated into the city of Chelm, trying to defend the city to the death. Colonel Rommel reported. Well, Colonel Rommel, you did a good job in the morning's battle. How many tanks did we lose? Lieutenant General Eckert asked. General, we lost more than 20 tanks during the battle in the morning. Most of them were damaged due to mechanical failures, and only a few were destroyed by the Russians. After the arsenal was improved, the tank's reliability of the tank has been greatly improved, and it will not be like before. When a battle is fought, all the tanks will be lost, Colonel Rommel said. Indeed, as the war continues, German arms companies are also constantly improving the tanks they produce. although the looks and performance haven't changed much. However, reliability has been greatly improved, as fewer and fewer tanks are destroyed due to mechanical failures. Lieutenant General Eckert nodded. The armored force has become their race force. It is precisely because of the existence of armored forces that they can easily break through the enemy's defenses. The price paid is also much less than attacking with infantry. Colonel Rommel, the Russians must have built a lot of fortifications in the city of Chelm. Can the armored forces cooperate with the infantry in the next battle? With the cooperation of the armored forces, the losses of the infantry will definitely be reduced a lot. Yes, Lieutenant General Eckert said. Although Rommel and his troops are now assigned to the 17th Army to fight, Lieutenant General Eckert has command authority. However, when it comes to many issues, Lieutenant General Eckert will still consult General Rommel first. Will not give orders directly and brutally. General, our armored forces have specially trained in street fighting during training. However, in street fighting, our losses will definitely be greater than in field fighting. If His Royal Highness agrees, we are willing to participate in the battle against Chelm during the attack in the city. Lieutenant General Rommel said. Okay, I will contact His Royal Highness the Crown Prince immediately. Lieutenant General Eckert said with a smile. Lieutenant General Eckert knew very well that the armored force was Qin Tian's heart and soul, and he had to seek Qin Tian's consent if he wanted the armored force to be involved in fierce street battles. Of course, Lieutenant General Eckert also believed that Qin Tian would definitely agree. Because of this, the casualties of the troops will be greatly reduced. As Horad, the headquarters of the Austrian army. Perhaps it was because of the impending war that the atmosphere here was very dignified. Staff officers came in and out, very busy. His Royal Highness, did your army launch an attack on the Russian army today? How is the situation? Marshal Herzendorf, Chief of Staff of the Austrian army, asked with a smile. Although it has been decided to cooperate with the German army's actions. However, Marshal Herzendorf, Baron Herzendorf, still had some doubts about whether he could win this battle, so he wanted to ask Qin Tian to get more accurate information. Your Excellency Marshal, the offensive has already started this morning, and everything is going very smoothly. Our 17th Army is attacking the Russian army's outer defense line in Chelm. Tomorrow, the 20th Army will also attack Zamozik, thoroughly defeat the 4th Russian Army. Qin Tian is very confident in his troops. Although, the Russian army has an absolute advantage in terms of military strength. But Qin Tian still believed that the victory would be his. Marshal Baron Herzendorf nodded, and Qin Tian's confidence seemed to have infected him as well. That's good. Victory will definitely belong to us. Baron Herzendorf said with a smile. Your Excellency Marshal, after we launch an attack on the Russians, their attack will probably start soon. Next, it's up to you. If we can't stop the Russian attack, then our plan will fail. Qin Tian said solemnly. His Royal Highness, please rest assured, we will definitely resist the attack of the Russian army. Marshal Herzendorf replied with a serious face. Of course he knew how much pressure the Austrian army would be under next, but he still believes that the Austrian army can withstand these pressures. Only when the Austrian army resisted the attack of the Russian army could they win the final victory. Otherwise, everything will fall short. Your Highness, General Eckert's telegram. The adjutant reported to Qin Tian. Qin Tian quickly read the telegram. A smile flashed across his face. Call General Eckert back and tell him that the armored forces are fully cooperating with all their actions. In addition, let the logistics department be ready to replenish the armored forces at any time. Qin Tian said. Yes, Your Highness. By the way, tell General Eckert not to rush to attack the city of Chelm, but to strike with sufficient firepower first. If necessary, you can also let the aviation team join in. Qin Tian specifically urged. Yes, Your Highness. The adjutant immediately sent a telegram. Your Highness, it seems that your army has made a breakthrough. Baron Herzendorf said with a smile. Yes, Your Excellency the Marshal. The 17th Army has defeated the Russian army outside the city of Chelm. The Russian army has retreated into the city of Chelm after suffering heavy losses. The next step is to launch a further attack. Annihilate all those Russian troops. Great, Your Highness. It seems that our start is very good. Marshal Herzendorf smiled. General Eckert, who was on the front line in Chelm, couldn't help laughing after receiving Qin Tian's callback order. The artillery, move forward and prepare to launch an artillery attack on Chelm. This whole afternoon is their firepower preparation time. Also, send a message to the 8th Air Force that we need their air support. Your Highness requests us, before launching an attack, it is best to destroy Chelm with shells and bombs. Lieutenant General Eckert ordered with a smile. Hiss. All the generals couldn't help but take a breath. If the German army attacked Chelm with fierce artillery fire and airstrikes and destroy the city, then the Russian army stationed in the city will inevitably suffer heavy losses. The fortifications they built will also be reduced to ruins in the German attack. In this case, it will undoubtedly make the Russian army's goal of blocking the German army's attack through street fighting and causing heavy damage to the German army's vital forces completely defeated. Of course, this will be very beneficial to the German army. It's just that it will consume a lot of ammunition. His Royal Highness's order is very correct. Destroy Chelm with artillery fire and bombing, causing heavy casualties to the Russians. At that time, let's see how they will stop our attack. The generals applauded. Chapter 329, Carpet Bombing. In the city of Chelm, Lieutenant General Fyodor and Lieutenant General Golovin of the Russian 4th Army are discussing how to strengthen the defense of Chelm. The German attack outside Chelm in the morning caused heavy losses to the Russian 4th Army. At the same time, it also allowed them to see the strength of the German army and knew that it was almost impossible to fight the German army in a field battle. Therefore, urban street fighting is their only way outside the city. General Golovin, the remaining 70,000 of us have all entered the city of Chelm. Chelm is only a small city, so we can deploy sufficient troops on every line of defense. The Germans want to. It is absolutely impossible to defeat us as easily as in the battle outside the city. Lieutenant General Fyodor smiled confidently. Well, after all, the Germans have too few troops. In urban street battles, the Germans' advantage and weapons will be weakened. The gap between us and the Germans will not be so big. If this battle is fought well, if we do, we may not have the opportunity to hit the Germans hard. Lieutenant General Golovin also seemed very confident. The most important thing is to find a way to deal with the German tanks. As long as the German tanks are destroyed, the German advantage will disappear. When our reinforcements arrive, we can launch a counterattack. At that time, I would like to see how the Germans will face our counterattack without tanks, Lieutenant General Fyodor said. In their view, the German army easily broke through the Russian army's defense line relying on its strong firepower and the powerful assault capabilities of its tanks. If these two advantages are deducted, the German army is not much stronger than the Russian army. It is not impossible to defeat the German army when the Russian army has an absolute superiority in strength. If the Germans dare to send those tanks into the city of Chelm to fight, we can destroy them. I have ordered all units to prepare for death squads. Once the German tanks enter the narrow streets, they would carry the explosives to blow up the German tanks, Lieutenant General Golovin said. Although, such tactics are very dangerous and cruel. For those daredevils, it is even a narrow escape. However, if there is no other way, this method can only be used. Lieutenant General Fyodor nodded. In a field battle, it is difficult to use death squads to attack German tanks. However, in urban street fighting, the chances of success are undoubtedly much greater. I hope that the proud and arrogant Germans will send their tanks to urban street fighting. Lieutenant General Fyodor sighed. If the German tanks do not enter the urban street fighting, they have nothing to do. Of course, in that case, they might be able to easily hold back the German army. The combat tasks assigned by Admiral Ivanov can be easily completed. On the afternoon of October 7, 1914, the 17th Army under the 8th Army of the German Army swept the outer defense line of the Russian army in Chelm and directly launched an attack on the Russian army stationed in the city of Chelm. However, the German attack this afternoon was not to use infantry to enter the city of Chelm and start a fierce street battle with the Russian army, but to use artillery to shell the city of Chelm. The 17th Army's 54 150mm heavy howitzers, 108 105mm light howitzers, and the remaining 150 75mm field guns fully included the small city of Chelm within their range. Immediately, violent shelling began. Boom. 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 More than 300 cannons of the German army began to shell Chelm. Accompanied by a thunderous sound, shells roared and smashed into the city of Chelm. The shells exploded, blowing the houses and streets in Chelm into ruins. Chelm is just a small city. Before the war broke out, the permanent population was only 50,000 to 60,000 people. This makes Chelm's urban area actually not that big. After more than 70,000 Russian troops poured into the city, it immediately made the city a little crowded. Although this made the Russian troops on each line of defense more sufficient, but also, the increased density also made them suffer relatively greater casualties once they encountered fierce German firepower. Boom. A 150mm artillery shell hit a 3-story building. In the violent explosion, the small building was directly blown down. A platoon of Russian soldiers stationed inside was buried directly in the rubble. A 105mm artillery shell hit a house next to a street. In an instant, bricks and rubble flew everywhere, and the Russian troops stationed under the street were smashed to death, and some people were even directly smashed to death. Under the heavy shelling of the German army, the buildings in the city of Chelm gradually began to be damaged. The originally beautiful small town began to turn into ruins bit by bit. The Russian troops stationed in the city were also under heavy shelling by the Germans, and their losses began to rise sharply. However, this is just the beginning. The German attack was not just shelling. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the German 8th Air Force arrived on the battlefield. More than 100 bombers formed a dense formation and flew over Chelm from the north. Hundreds of planes gathered densely together, like a dark cloud, blocking even the sun. The Russian officers and soldiers on the ground watched this scene with a stupefied look. God, how many planes the Germans have. With so many planes, do they want to erase Chelm from the map? A Russian officer said with a look of horror. Soon, the plane began to drop bombs. Although, each of these bombers can only carry 500 kilograms of bombs. A 25 kilogram bomb can only carry 20 pieces. However, hundreds of bombers dropped 2,000 bombs in one attack. This kind of bomb hit an area in the northern urban area of Chelm densely. Intensive explosions sounded, and the smoke shot straight into the sky. The buildings in the bombing area collapsed during the explosion. When the smoke cleared, the Russian soldiers stationed in the city of Chelm were horrified to find that the city had been completely blown into ruins. All the buildings have collapsed. Houses, streets, etc. no longer exist. It was as if it had been erased directly by someone. Of course, the Russian soldiers stationed in this area were also erased at the same time. Such a scene directly frightened the Russian officers and soldiers in the city of Chelm into a war. Some people even urinate out of fear. Chapter 330. The situation is not good. Boom. 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 Violent explosions continued to sound in the city of Chelm, and the German artillery was firing violently. In the sky, German planes are also constantly dropping bombs. The whole of Chelm, under the fierce firepower of the German army, is rapidly turning into ruins. One after another buildings were bombed. The streets were bombed into rubble. The whole city seemed to be at the end of the world. The Russian troops stationed in the city of Chelm also suffered heavy losses under the fierce firepower of the German army. Many Russian soldiers lost their lives, or were seriously injured in the shelling and bombing of the German army. God, how long will the German shelling and bombing last? Is it possible that they want to blow up all our troops in the city of Chelm? Lieutenant General Fieder closed his eyes in pain. Lieutenant General Golovin's face was also very ugly. Now they are not as confident as before. The fierce German firepower hit them like a slap in the face, swollen their faces. At the beginning, they had a good idea and wanted to use urban street fighting to make the German army pay heavy losses. However, before the street fighting started, the German army used powerful firepower to teach them a good lesson. However, the price the Russian army paid was too great. When the sun went down, the German shelling and bombing stopped. The 8th Air Force stopped bombing because the current bombers do not have the ability to take off and land at night and bomb. All actions can only be carried out during the day. The German bombardment can be carried out at night. But it is a pity that the heavy shelling in the afternoon not only exhausted the artillerymen, but also consumed almost all the shells stored by the German army. Although there are still some shells left, they are running out, and we need to prepare for the follow-up battle. Very good. The whole of Chelm has been turned into ruins under our firepower. It is estimated that the Russian troops stationed inside must have suffered heavy casualties. Tomorrow morning, launch an attack on Chelm. In 2 days Chelm must be captured. Lieutenant General Eckert ordered. Yes, General. Several division commanders replied. They are also full of confidence in tomorrow's attack. Even if it is a tragic urban street battle, it is undoubtedly much easier for the enemy to attack when the enemy has already suffered heavy losses under the fierce firepower of their own side. What's more, they can also get the support of armored forces. There are tanks with rough skin and thick flesh in front, and at the same time, tank guns can destroy all enemy's resistance. This will minimize the difficulty of this street fight. Contact the logistics department and replenish us with ammunition as soon as possible. It is best to conduct another round of shelling tomorrow morning to destroy all the fortifications built by the Russians overnight. Lieutenant General Eckert ordered. Yes, General. That night, the logistics force used cars to transport as much as possible artillery shells and other important war materials to the 17th Army to ensure that their attack the next day could proceed normally. Lieutenant General Eckert's prediction was not wrong. The Russian troops stationed in the city of Chelm, after the German firepower stopped, reported the situation they were facing to the rear. On the other hand, organize the soldiers and seize the time to build a position to deal with the attack that the German army will launch tomorrow. Lieutenant General Fiedler and Lieutenant General Golovin also wanted to cry, but had no tears. Because the German army's fierce firepower attack in the afternoon not only cost the Russian army more than 20,000 casualties, but also almost destroyed all the fortifications they built in the city of Chelm. This makes them have no advantage in the next battle. Therefore, it is naturally the best to be able to build some fortifications at night. General Dmitriev, who had already fled to Lviv, only felt a bit of fear after receiving the telegrams from Lieutenant General Fiedler and Lieutenant General Golovin. There was a kind of rejoicing in his heart. Fortunately he escaped quickly. Otherwise, he might be trapped in Chelm city. Maybe, he would be killed under the crazy firepower of the German army. But then, Admiral Dmitriev became a little worried. Originally, he thought that the Russian army could drag the German army to Chelm with the help of its superior force and urban street fighting, and even had a chance to turn defeat into victory. But I didn't expect that the German army would adopt such a tactic, directly blasting Chelm into ruins, and at the same time causing heavy losses to the Russian troops stationed there. In this case, it may be even more difficult for the Russian army to defend Chelm. Even if an army of reinforcement were sent to Chelm, they might still not be able to hold on. Order the 34th Army to strengthen the defense of Lviv. In addition, send a telegram to Zamoszyk's troops to prepare them for battle. The combat effectiveness of the Germans is stronger than we expected. Dmitry the Admiral sighed. Of course, Admiral Dmitriev did not forget to report the battle situation in Chelm to Admiral Ivanov. It can be regarded as a vaccination for Admiral Ivanov. In case the 4th Army fails to last for half a month, don't blame him too much. After all, it's not that they didn't try their best, but that the German attack was too powerful. Straight, the headquarters of the Russian Southwest Front Army, Admiral Ivanov is actively preparing for the attack of the main force of the Russian army on the Austrian defense line. The German attack has already begun, and we can't wait any longer. Tomorrow, the attack on the Austro-Hungarian Empire must begin. Now, we are competing with the Germans for time. Admiral Ivanov looked at the map, said secretly. Indeed, after Admiral Ivanov adopted the current tactics, they were competing with the German army for time. If the Russians can defeat Austria-Hungary before the German 8th Army destroys the 4th Army, they will win. Conversely, if the German 8th Army destroys the Russian 4th Army first, cutting off their retreat, then, waiting for the Russian army, I'm afraid it will be a failure. General, a telegram from General Dmitriev. The adjutant reported to Admiral Ivanov. Admiral Ivanov took the telegram and read it quickly. When he finished reading the telegram, his brows were tightly knit together. The German attack had just begun, but the 4th Army was almost unable to support it. This seems to mean that the combat effectiveness of the German army is stronger than they had expected. Send a telegram to the 3rd Army, the 8th Army, and the 11th Army. Tomorrow, we will do our best to attack. Admiral Ivanov's eyes flashed a flash of determination. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 331, Desperate Attack. I hope this time, we can defeat the Austro-Hungarian Empire in one fell swoop. Otherwise, the entire Southwest Front army will be finished, Admiral Ivanov said, staring at the map. The attack power of the German army was too strong, so Admiral Ivanov had to make a bad move. He knows very well that, if he blindly defends, he will only be solved bit by bit by the German army in the end. Only when they take the initiative to attack and defeat the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the shortest time, can they have a chance. However, such a tactic is too risky. Once the strategic goals are not fulfilled, what awaits them is failure. General Ruski, commander of the 3rd Army of the Russian Army, General Brushinov, commander of the 8th Army, and General Sirivanov, commander of the 11th Army, received a letter from General Ivanov after the telegram. The mood also became quite heavy. As the old subordinates of General Ivanov, they knew very well that, if the situation was not critical, General Ivanov would definitely not say such a thing. Order all the ministries, prepare for battle. Tomorrow morning at dawn, launch an attack. Before the sun goes down, we must tear through the defense lines of the Austro-Hungarian army and completely defeat them. Admiral Ruski issued an order. Yes, General. The commanders and division commanders of the Russian 3rd Army replied one after another. Generals Brushinov and Sirivanov also issued similar orders. They all regard tomorrow's attack as the most important battle. It can be said that it is a battle where only success is allowed and failure is not allowed. Everyone knows very well that if it fails, the consequences will be disastrous. The Russian army is very likely to lose in this battle, and the frontline commanders like them will not end well. October 8th, just after dawn, the Russian army's position was already busy. Soldiers were queuing for breakfast, and quartermasters were distributing ammunition. Of course, the food of the Russian army is undoubtedly the worst among the armies of the great powers. 2 potatoes and a piece of hard black bread are their breakfast. As for milk and meat, they are absolutely invisible, unless you are an officer. Otherwise you can only eat such a breakfast. On the artillery positions of the Russian army, 76.2mm field guns were also pushed out. The artillerymen are moving the artillery shells to the position, making preparations before firing. Although these 76.2mm field guns are weak and have a short range, they are the only cannons that the Russian army can rely on. In the Austrian army position opposite the Russian army, the soldiers also got up early and got ready for battle under the urging of the officer. Of course, the fear on the faces of many Austrian soldiers has not dissipated. Obviously, it was because of the psychological shadow after being defeated by the Russian army before. Compared to the Russian army, the morale of the Austrian army is low. However, their weapons and equipment are much better than the Russian army. The number of machine guns is also more than that of the Russian army. As for the cannon, let alone the heavy artillery of the Skoda factory is famous all over the world. The Austrian army is not only equipped with 75mm caliber field guns, but also equipped with a lot of 105mm light howitzers, and even 150mm heavy howitzers. In terms of the number of artillery alone, although it is not as good as the German army, it is also much stronger than the Russian army. Last night, the chief of the Austrian General Staff, Baron Herzendorf, personally summoned the commander of the 2nd Austrian Army, General Pomelmeli, the commander of the 3rd Army, General Borojevic, and the commander of the 4th Army, General Danker, commander of the army group. They are required to find ways to resist the Russian army's attack in today's battle, and they must not let the Russian army break through their defense line. In view of the 3 armies, the combat effectiveness is strong or weak. Marshal Herzendorf, Baron, specifically requested the stronger 2nd Army and 3rd Army as the main forces. The 4th Army, which has weaker combat effectiveness, serves as a reserve force. Although, this will make the troops on the defensive line 1/3 less than the offensive Russian army. However, when fighting, the defensive side has to take advantage of it. Especially if you have strong firepower, you can use fortifications and strong firepower to cause greater damage to the enemy. the attacking party will often pay a greater price. Austrian Fourth Army, mostly composed of Czechs, Slovaks and Slavic soldiers. Their morale is low, their actions are slow, their training is lax, and their combat effectiveness is low. If this group army were to go to the front line, Marshal Herzendorf was really worried that they would collapse under the fierce attack of the Russian army. Let the 4th Army serve as a reserve team, and let them send troops to fill in the event of a dangerous situation on the defense line. In this case, it is relatively safe. Qin Tian didn't raise any objection to Baron Herzendorf's arrangement. Although, in this battle, Baron Marshal Herzendorf stated that he would fully support him. However, he could not dictate the command of the Austrian army because of this. Otherwise, it will inevitably cause displeasure on the Austrian side. After all, even if you are an ally, there are some bottom lines that cannot be touched. On the other hand, Qin Tian didn't know much about the Austrian army either. It was much better to deploy as Marshal Baron Herzendorf, the chief of staff of the Austrian army, than to be deployed by him, a layman. Although, the combat effectiveness of the Austrian army is very bad. But Qin Tian believes that, if they defend with all their strength, they should still be able to withstand the attack of the Russian army. Fire. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the 3 Russian armies launched an attack on the Austrian defense line on the 200-kilometer defense line. Thousands of cannons began a fierce shelling. The Russian army attempted to use violent shelling to disintegrate the fighting spirit of the Austrian army and prepare for the next battle. It's just that the Russian army's shelling just started, and it was counterattacked by the Austrian army. Although the Austrian army only deployed 2 group armies on the front line, with more than 600,000 people, the strength is only equivalent to 2/3 of the Russian army. However, the number of their artillery is not less than that of the Russian army. Quantitatively, the two sides are evenly matched. However, in terms of the caliber and performance of the artillery, it is the Austrian army that has the upper hand. In terms of the quality of artillery, the two sides can be described as evenly matched. It's just that the morale of the Austrian army is a little weaker. So, after the artillery battle between the two sides started, they were evenly matched. Under the strict orders of the Austrian army officers, the Austrian artillery could even use their own large caliber heavy artillery to launch a suppressive attack on the Russian artillery positions, causing greater losses to the Russian artillery. Chapter 332, Fierce Battle. Boom. 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 In the eastern part of the Carpathian Mountains, the Russian army and the Austrian army, with more than 1.5 million people on both sides, launched a fierce offensive and defensive battle on the 200-kilometer long defense line. Whether it is the Russian army on the offensive side or the Austrian army on the defensive side, they have almost used all their strength. As soon as the battle started, the artillery on both sides started a fierce exchange of fire. The Russian army attempted to use artillery fire to destroy the Austrian fortifications, preferably to destroy the Austrian will to resist. Similarly, the Austrian army also hopes to use powerful artillery fire to cause greater damage to the Russian army, so that they can be in a favorable position in the following defensive operations to complete this combat mission. Boom. Boom. The 76.2mm artillery shells fired by the Russian army fell on the positions of the Austrian army. The fortifications built by the Austrian army were bombed to pieces, and occasionally Austrian soldiers were killed. The rest of the Austrian soldiers either hid in the anti-gun holes, or lay on the bottom of the trench, hugging their heads tightly, praying to God that the Russian shells would not fall on their heads. The morale of the Austrian army is relatively low. They held more advanced weapons than the Russian army, but they were defeated by the Russian army in the previous stage of the battle. This was undoubtedly a serious blow to the morale of the Austrian army. Of course, when the Russian army fought, they were not afraid of death, and their fighting will was much stronger than that of the Austrian soldiers. God, the Russian bombardment is too violent. If we stay here, we will be killed. Should we retreat? A young Austrian soldier said to his comrades with fear in his eyes. Idiot. Run away now? Do you want to be shot by the military police? The officer has already issued an order. This time, if you don't get an order, you must not retreat without authorization. An older soldier scolded. The young soldier's heart tightened suddenly. He turned around with a little guilt and looked at a place more than 100 meters away from their line of defense. A team of military police was guarding there. In front of the gendarmes, a heavy machine gun was set up. There is no doubt that, if they dare to escape this time, those military police will not hesitate to use heavy machine guns to shoot. The young Austrian soldier had no choice but to suppress the idea of fleeing and continued to squat in the trench. Baron Marshal Herzendorf, in order to prevent the Austrian army from retreating again, specially sent a large number of military police to the front line. These gendarmes have only one mission, and that is to deter those weak-willed troops and let them be firmly nailed to the front line after the battle begins. The escape of these cowards must not cause the entire front to be defeated. Under the deterrence of the military police, the soldiers of the Austrian army could only bite the bullet and fight the battle, instead of being easily intimidated by the Russian army as before. In fact, as long as they overcome the fear in their hearts and display the power of the weapons in their hands, not to mention defeating the Russian army, but holding their own defense line, there is no problem at all. Among the fierce counterattacks, the artillery of the Austrian army has achieved a lot of results. Their heavy artillery suppression caused a lot of losses to the artillery of the Russian army. The front line of Lesko. This is a key area for the Russian Third Army to attack. The Third Army has assembled half of its troops, hoping to break through here. After capturing Lesko, they crossed the Carpathian Mountains and attacked the Hungarian plain. General, our artillery has lost a lot. The Austrian artillery fire is very fierce. Up to now, we have destroyed 7 artillery positions and lost more than 100 cannons. The artillery commander reported to Admiral Rusky. Damn, how could this be? The state of the enemy army on the opposite side seems to be different. When fighting them before, their shelling was definitely not so violent. Admiral Rusky frowned tightly. General, do we still want to continue shelling? If this continues, I'm afraid it won't be long before all our cannons will be lost. The artillery commander said. Admiral Rusky considered for a while, and then said, 10 minutes. Let the artillery hold on for another 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the infantry will attack. I hope they can break through the enemy's defense line in one fell swoop. Yes, General. The artillery of the Russian army withdrew from the battle after 10 minutes. The remaining cannons retreated to the woods to hide. The artillery battle just now also made the artillerymen of the Russian army tremble with fear. After all, although the artillery seems to be safe, the artillery battle is still very tragic. No one knows when the enemy's shells will fall from the sky and blow themselves to pieces. Especially in this battle, the Austrian artillery performed very well, which made the Russian artillery even more worried. Fortunately, the order to retreat was issued, and they finally survived. When the artillery of the Russian army withdrew from the battle, the infantry of the Russian army immediately launched an attack. Come on. Tear through the enemy's defenses and kill them all. Allah, Allah. Countless Russian soldiers jumped out of the trenches and rushed to the Austrian positions. They chanted slogans and charged forward indomitably, like a great tide, flocking to the front line of the Austrian army. Quick, get into position. The Russians are attacking. My God. There are so many Russians. Can we withstand their attack? After many Austrian soldiers entered the position, seeing this scene, they couldn't help but feel their scalps tingling with fright. Quick, fire. Stop those Russians from approaching our position. If our position is breached, everyone will die. The officers of the Austrian army ordered loudly. Even, in order to take care of soldiers who speak different languages, they have to issue orders in multiple languages. This is undoubtedly a great test for these officers. After all, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-ethnic country. This dual empire consisted of more than a dozen kingdoms, duchies, and marquesas. Each country had its own language. Therefore, it is a severe test for any commander to command such a multilingual unit. Fire. Da da da. Bang, bang, bang. Following the command of the commander, all kinds of firepower of the Austrian army started shooting one after another. Heavy machine guns and light machine guns all started firing violently. The rifles in the hands of the soldiers also started shooting one after another. Suddenly, intensive firepower enveloped the attacking Russian army. Countless Russian soldiers were shot and fell to the ground. However, even so, it still failed to scare these Russian soldiers. They passed the corpses of their comrades and continued to attack the Austrian positions. Chapter 333. The attack is frustrated. Go to hell. Asterisk 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 Russian. A heavy machine gun of the Austrian army was firing crazily. The industrial strength of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is very good, and their military products also have excellent performance. Although the heavy machine guns equipped by the Austrian army cannot be compared with the general-purpose machine guns equipped by the German army, they are at least at the leading level in the world. Dense bullets enveloped the Russian army like a torrential rain. The Russian army, which maintain a dense formation to attack, became the best target for heavy machine guns. Pieces of Russian troops were shot and fell to the ground as if they were cutting wheat. Allah, Allah. Ula of the Russian army charged forward with momentum like a rainbow. Although they are poorly equipped, however, when they attacked, they were not afraid of death. Such tactics enable them to intimidate their opponents and defeat them in battle. It's just that this time, the Ula charge of the Russian army doesn't seem to be very effective. The Austrian soldiers on the opposite side didn't seem to be intimidated by them, and they were still fighting back with powerful firepower. Under such circumstances, the losses of the Russian army began to soar. Boom. Clear gunshots sounded, and a Russian soldier was shot in the chest, and his charging body suddenly fell to the ground. In the trenches of the Austrian army, young Austrian soldiers are pulling the bolt and loading the next bullet. At first, his face was full of fear. However, gradually, he has slowly overcome the fear in his heart and began to fight calmly. Many Austrian soldiers, almost all of whom were in battle, slowly changed. Ula's charge from the Russian army scared them enough that many of them almost ran away. However, under the strong deterrence of their own military police, they did not dare to escape, so they could only bite the bullet and continue to fight. But soon, they discovered that the Russian army's attack had nothing special about it other than its astonishing momentum. They were all human beings, and they would be killed if they were hit by bullets. As long as you can overcome the fear in your heart, you can defeat them. In this way, the morale of the Austrian army began to gradually recover. The frontline commanders of the Austrian army finally breathed a sigh of relief after discovering this change. No one wants to be defeated. When they were defeated by the Russians before, they were also very aggrieved. It's not that their soldiers are inferior to the Russians, or that their weapons and equipment are inferior to the Russians. The main reason is that everyone is frightened by the Russians. After overcoming the fear, the Austrian army finally began to display its due combat effectiveness. The morale of the Austrian army gradually recovered, and the defense line began to stabilize. This is not a good thing for the Russians on the offensive side. Damn, how could their firepower be so powerful? Admiral Ruski saw this scene and couldn't help being stunned in shock. You know, in the previous battles, the Austrian army has always been vulnerable, but now, they seem to have changed their army. Such a change really made him a little unbelievable. General, is it not the Austro-Hungarian army that is fighting us, but the Germans? Otherwise, how could the combat effectiveness of the Austro-Hungarian army have improved so much? Said a lieutenant general. Germans? How is this possible? Let's not say that the Germans are attacking the Fourth Army. Even if they were really Germans, they would have stopped blindly defending and launched an attack. If the Germans launched if we attack, can we withstand their attack? Admiral Ruski shook his head. A group of generals of the Russian army also looked deeply convinced. Indeed, the German army was much stronger than the Austrian army. If they were facing the German army, I'm afraid that the offensive and defensive momentum would have been reversed long ago. Boom. 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 Shells continued to explode in the queue of the Russian army, and soldiers of the Russian army were constantly torn to pieces. Da da da. The dense firepower network composed of light and heavy machine guns of the Austrian army recklessly harvested the lives of these Russian soldiers. Under the powerful firepower of the Austrian army, the Russian army suffered extremely heavy losses. Even if the Russian soldiers are not afraid of death when fighting, their courage will disappear when the comrades around them fall one after another. Under the huge loss, the Russian army had to retreat in the first round of attack. Countless Russian soldiers turned and fled. The speed of their escape was actually much faster than their attack speed. Long live. Long live. We have defeated the Russians. Seeing the Russian soldiers fleeing, cheers from the soldiers resounded from the Austrian defense line. Countless Austrian soldiers cheered loudly. They haven't had a victory like this in a long time. It seems that the Russians are not invincible. Before, we were just intimidated by them. Now, we have understood that the Russians are just paper tigers, and there is nothing to fear at all," said a young Austrian soldier. "Haha, the Russians are so vulnerable. From now on, we don't have to be afraid of them at all." Such words are everywhere. Through this battle, the low morale of the Austrian soldiers was quickly revived. "Bastard. After half an hour, continue to attack. Even if the cowards of the Austro-Hungarian Empire have become different, we can still defeat them," Admiral Ruski ordered through gritted teeth. Although, he knew that this battle might not go as smoothly as they expected. But now they have no way out. This battle still had to be fought like this. "Yes, General." Not only the attack of the Russian Third Army was frustrated, but the attacks of the Russian 8th Army and the 11th Army encountered also a strong counterattack from the Russian army. The Austrian defense line seemed to have become impregnable overnight. The Austrian army, whose morale was low and could be defeated by a single charge of the Russian army, seemed to have reborn, and their combat effectiveness had been greatly improved. This made the Russian army inevitably suffered severe losses in front of the Austrian defense line. Although, the Russian army launched multiple rounds of attacks in the ensuing battle. However, it still failed to break through the Austrian defense line. Although, their offensive also cost the Austrian army some price. But overall, the Russian army suffered even greater losses. More importantly, after this fierce battle, the morale of the Austrian soldiers was revived. When the weapons are not as good as the Austrian army and there is no advantage in military strength, it is conceivable that the Russian army wants to break through the Austrian army's defense line. Chapter 334, Urban Street Fighting. When the Russian army gathered three armies and launched a fierce attack on the Austrian defense line, the attack of the German 8th Army continued. The German 20th Army and part of the 8th Armored Division, under the leadership of Lieutenant General Mackensen, launched a fierce attack on Zamość, which was stationed by a part of the Russian 4th Army. Everything is like a replica of the German 17th Army and the 8th Armored Division outside the city of Chelm yesterday. The troops of the Russian 4th Army simply cannot withstand the attack of the German armored forces. The Russian army's defense line outside Zamość city was quickly broken by the German army. The Russian army, which suffered heavy losses, had to retreat to the city of Zamość in an attempt to resist. However, what awaited them was still the heavy shelling of the German army and the bombing of the air force. The shelling and bombing of the German army in Chelm yesterday afternoon achieved good results. Such excellent combat experience will of course be extended to other troops. In this case, the German army can win at the least cost. While the German 20th Army and a part of the 8th Armored Division beat the Russian army in Zamość, the German 17th Army and part of the 8th Armored Division continued their attack in Chelm. Shortly after dawn, the artillery of the German 17th Army began shelling Chelm. Last night, a large shipment of shells was brought in, which enabled the cannon to continue firing. The fierce artillery fire once again attacked Chelm, a city that had basically been turned into ruins. The violent explosion sounded again in the city. The Russian army, which had just woken up, had to accept the baptism of the German artillery fire again. The Russian soldiers in the city are already very tired. Last night, they were asked by the officers to repair the damaged fortifications, and they continued until very late before they were able to rest. Even so, it was just a little repair of those broken fortifications. It is very difficult to say how effective these fortifications re-established on the ruins can play under the fierce attack of the German army. However, what the Russian army did not expect was that after dawn the next day, the German army would launch another large-scale shelling. The fortifications they painstakingly built were once again destroyed by the fierce German shelling. At the same time, the German bombardment caused even greater casualties to the Russian troops who lost their cover in the city. As a result, the number of Russian troops in the city further decreased. Of course, let alone the morale of the Russian army, it is almost about to hit the bottom. Not only the artillery of the German 17th Army launched an attack, but the German 8th Air Force also joined the attack on Chelm. A large number of bombers dropped bombs over the city of Chelm and carried out carpet bombing of the Russian army in the city. Although this intensive bombing method is a bit of a waste of ammunition. However, I have to admit that the effect is very good. A bombed area, everything will be bombed. The losses caused to the Russian army are also very astonishing. Are the Germans planning to use shelling and bombing to destroy us directly? How long will their endless shelling and bombing last? Lieutenant General Fider roared angrily. Now he was like a bear trapped in a trap, although he slapped around angrily, but there was no hope of escaping at all. Lieutenant General Golovin said nothing, but his face was as dark as the bottom of a pot. Originally, they all thought that with their huge force, they could hold out in Chelm for a long time. Even, there is a chance to turn defeat into victory. However, the German army gave them a slap in the face with facts, letting them know that all their previous assumptions were nothing but delusions. Before the German army really launched an offensive, they had already caused them to pay huge casualties. Under such circumstances, not to mention defeating the German army, even defending Chelm was almost impossible. The current situation is very unfavorable to us. The Germans actually adopted such a tactic against us. It is almost impossible for us to resist their attack in Chelm. Lieutenant General Golovin said. Lieutenant General Fider nodded. However, we have no other way. Unless we abandon Chelm and flee to Lvov. But if we do that, General Dmitriev and Ivan Generalnov will not let us go. Lieutenant General Golovin smiled bitterly. It seems that we can only defend here. Indeed, the Russian army's large-scale offensive against the Austrian army has already begun, which means that their plan has been fully implemented and cannot be stopped at all. Before the Russian army defeated the Austrian army, the task of the 4th Army was to resist the attack of the German 8th Army. Anyone who dares to violate this order will be severely punished. Therefore, Lieutenant General Fider and Lieutenant General Golovin, even knowing that it is not a good idea to stick to Chelm. However, they have no other way. General, the German offensive has begun. They dispatched a large number of infantry and tanks to attack the city. A staff officer reported. Order all the ministries to defend the line of defense. No one is allowed to retreat without an order to retreat. Lieutenant General Fider ordered viciously. Yes, General. The staff officer immediately went to convey the order. How long we can persist in Chelm depends on the German attack. I hope we can persist a little longer. Lieutenant General Golovin said. Urban street fighting is not field fighting. The advantage of the Germans is not that great anymore. Lieutenant General Fider said. Outside the city of Chelm, the German attack has begun. The 49th Infantry Division and the 50th Infantry Division under the German 17th Army divided into two groups and launched an attack on Chelm. A part of the 8th Armored Division led by Colonel Rommel was also divided into two parts to assist the two infantry divisions in their offensive. In this round of offensive alone, the German army invested nearly 40,000 troops. It can be seen that Lieutenant General Zeckert is full of confidence in this attack. You know, the original Russian army deployed in Chelm had a total of 100,000 troops. However, the combined losses of yesterday and this morning have resulted in the loss of more than half of the Russian army. The number of Russian troops in the city is less than 50,000. Facing the German attack, it was undoubtedly very difficult for them to defend Chelm. The 8th Army of the German army has specially trained in the subject of urban street fighting, although this is the first time it has conducted actual combat. However, they performed handily, very well. Chapter 335. Vulnerable. The two infantry divisions of the 17th Army of the German Army and part of the 8th Armored Division launched an attack on the city of Chelm, officially kicking off the prelude to the tragic street fighting. The German army attempted to wipe out the Russian army entrenched here in one fell swoop in the street fighting. Similarly, the Russian army also hopes to use street fighting to defeat the powerful German army. As for whose goal can be realized in the end, I'm afraid that we have to wait for the final result of the battle. The defense line of the Russian army on the edge of the city could not withstand the German attack at all. The tanks led the infantry, and after launching a round of assault, they could easily defeat the Russian army. Of course, the real battle will start after entering the city. After the German army entered Chelm, they immediately launched an attack according to the previous training. In street fighting, it is obviously unrealistic for large forces to gather together to attack. Narrow streets will restrict the deployment of troops. Therefore, the troops are often divided into small units with companies and platoons as units to fight in the streets of the city. This way of fighting will be more flexible. Especially after receiving the support of armored forces, they can easily defeat their opponents in urban street battles. A tank is marching on the ruined street. The turret of the tank is constantly rotating, searching for possible threatening targets. Dozens of German soldiers followed behind the tank, guarding all around. They also provide protection for tanks, while drawing on the protection of tanks. Suddenly, gunfire rang out. A Russian machine gun erected on a ruin began to shoot. Several German soldiers were shot on the spot and fell to the ground. The rest of the soldiers also quickly lay down on the ground. The tank played a great role at this time. The turret rotated and aimed at the Russian machine gun fire point on the ruins. Boom. The tank gun fired, and a high explosive bomb hit the point of fire of the Russian machine gun in the blink of an eye, blowing it up. At the same time, the machine guns of the tanks also began to fire, suppressing other Russian troops on the ruins. The German soldiers who were lying on the ground immediately began to attack under the cover of the tank's machine gun fire. They outflanked the Russian army's retreat, and after a fierce battle, they killed all the dozens of Russian soldiers stationed here. After clearing the surrounding area, the German army began to move on. The German army used this tactic to gradually clean up the Russian army entrenched in the city of Chelm, constantly eroding the living space of the Russian army and squeezing their activity space. When the living space of the Russian army was completely squeezed out, they were wiped out, and Chelm also fell into the hands of the German army. Of course, for the German army, the main purpose of this battle is to eliminate the Russian army's vital forces, not to compete for cities. The gains and losses of a city and a pool are not important. The important thing is to get rid of the more than 1 million troops of the Russian Southwest Front army. In that case, it can be regarded as a victory in this battle. Boom. A mortar shell fell into the German column that was carefully searching. Several German soldiers were killed in the bombing. Hidden, shouted a platoon leader. The rest of the soldiers immediately looked for hiding places. Boom. Boom. The mortars of the Russian army fired continuously, but when the German army was already prepared, it did not cause any casualties to the German army. Mortar, kill the enemy's artillery. The platoon leader ordered loudly. Platoon leader, the Russian mortars are deployed on the corner of the street, out of our reach. The mortar team replied. Bastard. Where's the sniper? Can you kill the Russian mortar? The platoon leader asked. Can't aim, replied the sniper. Damn. Request support from the battalion headquarters. We need a tank. The platoon leader ordered. Yes, platoon leader. The correspondent immediately bowed his back, evacuated the street, and rushed to ask for help. However, the platoon leader soon realized that his request for help was completely unnecessary. An F-2 fighter jet flew over the street, and after discovering the firepower of the Russian army, the fighter jet immediately launched an attack. A series of bullets from aviation machine guns fired over, turning the Russian soldiers who were hiding in the corner of the street on their backs. The bullets of aviation machine guns are extremely powerful, and those who are hit basically have no way to survive. When the bullet hits the mortar of the Russian army, sparks burst out. Great. Attack. The German platoon leader immediately launched an attack after seeing this scene. Under the cover of aircraft firepower, a dozen soldiers rushed over and eliminated all the Russian troops hiding there. The planes of the 8th Air Force also came to help when the 17th Army attacked Chelm. However, almost all the bombers went as ammo to support the attack of the 20th Army. Only some fighters came to support the 17th Army. But even so, their support gave the 17th Army great help during the battle. Even though Chelm has become ruins under the indiscriminate bombing of the German army, the Russian army is like a mouse, hiding in the ruins and fighting the German army. In many cases, attacking from the ground, it is not easy to eliminate them. However, for aircraft in the sky, it is very easy to spot the Russian army and launch an attack. The tactics of mutual cooperation between the air and the ground, and I don't know how many years ahead of the Russian army, which made the Russian army's plan to defend Chelm completely aborted. General, the Germans' offensive is very fierce. They not only have tanks to cooperate, but also planes in the sky. We can't resist their attack at all. The casualties of the troops are very heavy, and the morale is also falling very quickly. A Russian military division, the commander reported to Lieutenant General Svidar and Golovin. Damn. Isn't it just street fighting? The Germans even used aircraft and tanks. How can we persevere? Lieutenant General Svidar ordered angrily. Lieutenant General Golovin's face was also very ugly. In their view, the tactics of the Germans are too bullying. According to the tactics of the German army, the Russian army in Chelm was simply vulnerable. Wanting to persist here for half a month is even more idiotic. If it is not done well, it will not last for 4 or 5 days. Of course, even so, Lieutenant General Golovin overestimated the Russian army. Under the fierce attack of the German army, in one morning, the German army had already occupied 1/3 of the urban area of Chelm. According to this speed, the entire city of Chelm can be occupied in a maximum of 2 days. As for the Russian army stationed here, one can imagine what the final result will be. Chapter 336, Fighting Aid. When can the 22nd Army arrive? Lieutenant General Fiedler asked. As the German army's offensive became more and more fierce, and they suffered heavy losses, they obviously could not last long in the city of Chelm, so they had to pin their hopes on the reinforcement. The 22nd Army set off yesterday morning. Calculating the time, we will be able to arrive this afternoon. However, if that guy Boris deliberately dawdled on the road, it would be difficult to say. After all, our situation is now critical. The Germans are too powerful. That guy Boris will not rush to die, Lieutenant General Golovin said with a gloomy face. If it were him, I'm afraid he wouldn't rush to Chelm. No, we can't let that guy hang around any longer. We need more reinforcement. Otherwise, with the strong attack power of the Germans, we may not be able to last for 3 days, Lieutenant General Fiedler said. Then we have to send a telegram to the general and ask him to urge the 22nd Army, Lieutenant General Golovin said. Lieutenant General Fiedler nodded. They and Lieutenant General Boris are both Lieutenant General commanders, and their ranks and positions are equal. Therefore, they have no way to order Lieutenant General Boris to do anything. Only General Dmitriev has this power. The sharp attack of the German army caused heavy losses to the Russian army stationed in Chelm. As a last resort, they had no choice but to turn their minds on the reinforcement, hoping that the reinforcement would arrive in time, so that they could persist in Chelm for a longer period of time. Outside the city of Chelm, the headquarters of the German 17th Army, Lieutenant General Zeckert, the commander, and a group of division commanders are listening to the report from the front line. General, so far, our advance is going smoothly, although the resistance of the Russian army is still very tenacious. However, with the whole of Chelm being bombed into ruins, the fortifications of the Russian army have been destroyed by us. It's almost there. There are very few fortifications that they can rely on. The threat to us is naturally very small. In addition, our armored force and air force cooperated to effectively attack the Russian army and destroy there. The firepower point has cleared the way for the infantry to attack. At present, we have cleared almost 1/3 of the city of Chelm. If it arrives in the afternoon, we will probably be able to control such a large city again, the staff officer said to everyone introduced. Very good. This means that by tomorrow at the latest, we will be able to take down the whole of Chelm. Lieutenant General Zeckert smiled. Qin Tian's order to the 8th Army was to require them to defeat the 4th Russian Army within half a month, copy the back route of the Russian Southwest Front Army, and together with the Austrian Army, attack the Russian Southwest Front Army to completely solve the problem. Defeating the Russian 4th Army is undoubtedly the primary task of the German 8th Army. Chelm, which was attacked by the 17th Army, had 1/3 of the strength of the Russian 4th Army. If they can get rid of the Russian army here within 3 days, then the subsequent offensive will be much smoother. General, judging from the current situation, there should be no problem in taking Chelm tomorrow. As the casualties of the Russian army increase, the possibility of their stubborn resistance will become smaller and smaller. Morale will also be reduced. It will become more and more depressed, and the will to fight will become more and more fragile. It can be said that defeating them is already a certainty, said the commander of the 49th Infantry Division. Lieutenant General Zeckert nodded. After solving the Russian army's troops in Chelm, we can attack westward and cooperate with the 20th Army to take down Zamość. In this case, the main force of the Russian 4th Army will be solved by us. The next battle will undoubtedly be much easier to fight. The other generals nodded again and again. Everyone was very optimistic about this battle. General, the air team reported that their reconnaissance plane found a Russian army 20 kilometers southwest of Chelm and was approaching Chelm. A staff officer came in and reported, another Russian army? How many people are there? Lieutenant General Zekert's heart tightened, and he asked quickly, "Now is the critical moment for their attack on Chelm. If a Russian army appears and attacks them, it will definitely affect their battle plan. General, the aviation team predicts that the Russian army will be around 50,000 people." The staff officer continued. 50,000? General, although 50,000 is not many, it is definitely a lot. If they are allowed to enter Chelm, this will strengthen the defense of the Russian army. If we want to take Chelm, I'm afraid we will have to. It will take more time. The support army of the Russian army must not be allowed to enter Chelm, said the commander of the 51st Infantry Division. Zek nodded, and he also had this opinion. However, the 50,000 Russian army is no less than the 17th Army. This is also a huge threat to them. Colonel Rommel, how many tanks are available now? Lieutenant General Zekert asked. If you want to attack the 50,000 reinforcement of the Russian army and defeat them in one fell swoop, the support of the armored forces is absolutely indispensable. General, we still have about 70 tanks available to start. Colonel Rommel replied. Well, dispatch 50 tanks to cooperate with the 51st Infantry Division to launch an attack on the Russian reinforcement. In addition, I will contact the 8th Air Force to let them bomb the Russian reinforcement. Try to defeat them all at once. The reinforcement of the Russian army. If the reinforcement of the Russian army are defeated, I want to see how long the Russian army in the city can last. Lieutenant General Zekert said. Yes, General. Both Colonel Rommel and the commander of the 51st Infantry Division replied. Although, the 51st Infantry Division plus the 50 tanks dispatched by the 8th Armored Division have a total strength of less than 20,000 troops. Compared with the 50,000 Russian troops, they are undoubtedly at an extreme disadvantage in terms of strength. However, Lieutenant General Zekert still believes that there is no problem at all in defeating the Russian reinforcement with the cooperation of armored forces and air force fighters. After the Russian reinforcement are defeated, the Russian defenders in Chelm will probably be shaken again and their will to fight. When the time comes, it will be even easier for them to take down Chelm. While the 51st Infantry Division and armored units attacked the Russian reinforcement, the 49th Infantry Division and the 50th Infantry Division continued to attack Chelm and could not give the Russian army in the city of Chelm any respite. Lieutenant General Zekert ordered. Yes, General. The commanders of the 49th Infantry Division and the 50th Infantry Division also replied. The 17th Army and the 8th Armored Division immediately took action. Part of the troops continued to attack Chelm, while the other part rushed to the reinforcement of the Russian army. Chapter 337, Raid. On the road from Lviv to Chelm, the Russian army in grey uniforms is marching. Although these Russian soldiers were tall, they were sallow and thin, and looked malnourished. Their marching ranks were not neat at all, and looked very messy. However, there is no way to do this. The quality of the Russian army is at the bottom among the great powers. This Russian army is the 22nd Infantry Army under the Russian 4th Army, which is almost a pure infantry army. Except for a small number of horses used to drag artillery and transport supplies, the rest of the people marched entirely on their feet. Of course, high-ranking officers and generals are exceptions, and they can ride horses. No matter how difficult the conditions of the Russian army are, the needs of generals and senior officers can still be guaranteed. General, we are only 10 kilometers away from Chelm. It is estimated that we will arrive this evening. However, the Germans are storming Chelm. Our troops stationed in Chelm suffered losses due to the German attack. It's terrible. I'm afraid it's not a good idea for us to arrive in Chelm at this time. A major general and division commander said to Lieutenant General Boris, commander of the 22nd Army, who was riding on a tall horse. Of course I know. The two guys Fiedler and Golovin are almost unable to hold on under the onslaught of the Germans. That's why they asked the general to put pressure on me and ask me to rush to the sea quickly. I don't want to go, or I don't want to go so soon. But what can I do? The general's attitude is very strict. If we don't arrive at Chelm before today, the general will not let us go, Lieutenant General Boris said with some helplessness. General, are the Germans really that powerful? Another major general asked. Although, the German army has successively made the Russian army pay a heavy price. But the 22nd Infantry Army of the Russian army has never fought against the German army. The strength of the German army is heard from other troops. How powerful the German army is, they don't know. The Germans are indeed very powerful, otherwise, Fiedler and Golovin would not have been forced to such a point. Boris said, "Order the troops to speed up the march. In any case, since the general's order has been issued, we have no way to disobey it. Hurry to Chelm as soon as possible, strengthen the defense there, and hope to withstand the German attack." Lieutenant General Boris gave the order. Tens of thousands of Russian troops began to speed up and rushed towards Chelm. The marching queue meanders and circles on the plain like a long great snake. Hoo, hoo, hoo. Suddenly, there was a sharp whistling sound in the sky, and small black spots were approaching at high speed. The expressions of the Russian troops on the ground changed drastically after hearing this voice. The war has started for more than 2 months, and they are all veterans who have experienced the baptism of war, so they naturally know what it means. Bombardment. Take cover. 5 kilometers in front of the Russian army, the artillery of the German 51st Infantry Division was firing at the Russian army 18 150mm heavy howitzers, 36 105mm light howitzers and 50 75mm field guns started shooting frantically. The superior's order was to let them, in the shortest possible time, drop more shells on the heads of the Russians, causing them as many casualties as possible. Boom. 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 The shells kept falling to the ground and exploded, and the shockwave engulfed the shrapnel and exploded in all directions. Russian soldiers were constantly being taken away. The originally irregular formation of the Russian army was in a mess at this time. Damn, why did the Germans appear here? They also attacked us? What are those 2 idiots, Fiedler and Golovin, doing? Lieutenant General Boris was furious. However, complaining at this time has no effect. The German shelling, so violent, is harvesting the lives of these Russian officers and soldiers. Where's our artillery? Immediately deploy and fight back. General, the Germans don't seem to have many cannons, only 100 or so, which means that they don't have many troops. If we launch a counterattack, we will definitely be able to defeat them. A Russian major general suggested. Okay, launch an attack and break through the blocking of the Germans. Lieutenant General Boris ordered. He also thought about it. This is clearly the German army's blocking of them, preventing them from entering Chelm. This also means that the Battle of Chelm has probably entered the most critical moment. If they were unable to reach Chelm in time, the fall of Chelm might be a foregone conclusion. At that time, not only the troops of Fiedler and Golovin will be wiped out, but they will also be encircled and suppressed by the superior forces of the German army. The general of the Russian army began to organize troops and prepare for a counterattack. However, at this moment, a large number of German aircraft appeared in the sky. In order to cooperate with the 17th Army's attack on the Russian reinforcement, the 8th Air Force specially mobilized 50 bombers and 50 fighter jets for airstrikes against the Russian 22nd Army. Find the target, give priority to attacking the artillery positions of the Russian army and those Russian troops that are gathering. The commander of the 8th Air Force in charge of this operation issued an order. Dozens of bombers and fighter jets immediately began to lower their altitude and discovered the attack. Plane. German plane. Run away. The appearance of German aircraft made the Russian 22nd Army panic again. Boom. 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 The artillery of the 22nd Army of the Russian army has become the key target of the Air Force. Those artillerymen were originally freeing the cannons from behind the flattery and pushing them to the artillery positions. But the appearance of German planes made them flee in all directions, and no one cared about those cannons at all. The gathered cannons undoubtedly became the best targets for German bombers. Start dropping bombs. The magazine of a fighter jet was opened, and bombs fell from the sky one after another. Boom. 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 The artillery shell hit the artillery position of the Russian army, and there were continuous explosions. The Russian army's cannons were destroyed one by one during the explosion, and those Russian troops who were lining up to launch a counterattack against the German army became the targets of fighter jets of the German Air Force. Da-da-da. Fighters flew over the formation of the Russian army, and aviation machine guns fired wildly. The dense machine gun bullets hit the queue of the Russian army, leaving traces of blood and dead bodies. Countless Russian soldiers fell to the ground amidst screams. The remaining Russian soldiers ran around like headless chickens, almost peeing out of fear. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 338, Collapse. Da da da. Boom. 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 The fighter jets and bombers of the German Air Force unscrupulously launched attacks on the Russian army. For them, this is completely a killing feast. The Russian army exposed to the world became the target of their massacre. Almost every pilot, after passing through this battle, has the blood of Russian soldiers on his hands. Boom. 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 The artillery of the German army also continued to fire and cooperated with the Air Force, further causing greater losses to the Russian army. Under the fierce attack of the German army, the casualties of the Russian army are rising sharply. At the same time, the German attack dealt a devastating blow to the morale of the Russian army. How could the German attack be so powerful? Lieutenant General Boris looked desperate, although he already knew that the German attack was very strong. However, now that he has actually experienced the German attack, he realizes that the German army is stronger than he expected. It can be said that the German army is completely different from the Russian army. The combat effectiveness of the Russian army cannot catch up with the German army, even if it is flattered. General, what should we do? The troops are in a mess now. It is impossible for us to continue our counterattack, a major general said. After being attacked by the German army, the Russian army suffered heavy losses, and at the same time morale also fell to the bottom. Under such circumstances, how could it be possible to organize a counterattack? How big are our casualties? Lieutenant General Boris stood up and looked at the fleeing Russian soldiers around him, his face as dark as the bottom of a pot. Before they reached Chelm, they were hit by a thunderous blow from the Germans. This made him no longer have much confidence in this plan. General, it is difficult to count now. However, our losses may not be so small. Lieutenant General Boris frowned, as if he was thinking about whether to move on. If you want to move on, you have to tear through the German blockade point. Can the 22nd Infantry Army of the Russian army do it now? This is probably very difficult. But if they retreat, General Dmitriev can't explain it. Therefore, Lieutenant General Boris was caught in a dilemma. However, Lieutenant General Boris will not have to worry about it soon, because the German army has already made a choice for him. After the airstrike of the German 8th Air Force ended, the 50 tanks of the 8th Armored Division, which had already been prepared, and the infantry of the 3 infantry regiments of the 51st Infantry Division launched an attack on the Russian army. 50 tanks, leading tens of thousands of infantry, launched an attack. Although, in terms of military strength, the Russian army still has an absolute advantage. However, in panic, morale suffered a devastating blow at the same time. Under such circumstances, how could they withstand the German attack? Boom. 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 The German tanks fired with tank guns while marching, causing further damage to the Russian army. What's that? During the chaos, some Russian soldiers discovered the approaching tanks. Many of them saw tanks for the first time. Seeing those black painted iron guys approaching them, many people were frightened. Tanks. The German tanks are coming. A Russian officer shouted in horror. The track of the tank crushed the ground and approached the Russian army without hesitation. The tens of thousands of German infantry behind the tank also showed a strong fighting spirit. This kind of momentum made the Russian army frightened. Damn, the Germans are calling. Open fire and stop them. A Russian officer ordered. Da da da. Bang, bang, bang. Part of the Russian army opened fire, heavy machine guns and rifles, and started shooting, trying to stop the German armored forces. However, they soon discovered that neither heavy machine guns nor rifles could cause any harm to those black painted iron guys. On the contrary, the German tanks suppressed the Russian army with tank guns. The heavy machine guns fired by the Russian army became the key targets of the German tanks. The tank gun of a tank aimed at a heavy machine gun of the Russian army that was firing. The driver stopped abruptly, and the gunner immediately opened fire. Boom. In the blink of an eye, the shell exploded, and the heavy machine gun of the Russian army was directly blown into a pile of parts. The German tanks fought and walked, and soon broke through to the Russian defense line, only a few hundred meters away. The soldiers of the Russian army were retreating in a panic, and they had been frightened by the German tanks. The machine guns on the German tanks also started firing, and the intensive firepower knocked down the Russian soldiers to the ground. "Mortar, kill the German tanks for me," a Russian officer shouted loudly. A mortar was erected, and the gunner aimed at a German tank, and opened fire soon. Boom. Boom. 2 consecutive shells flew out of the barrel and hit the German tank. The first shell exploded beside the tank without causing any damage to the tank at all. Another shell, although it hit the front armor of the tank. But unfortunately, the power of the mortar is too small, and it is undoubtedly impossible to penetrate the later armor of the tank. The officer of the Russian army couldn't help being stunned when he saw this scene. He couldn't believe it at all, since there was nothing wrong with the German tank that was hit by the shell. Run away. German tanks are indestructible. A group of Russian soldiers fled one after another. However, the counterattack of the German tanks came soon. The coaxial machine gun fired wildly at these Russian troops. The dense bullets shot all these Russian troops to death. General, the German offensive is too fierce, and we have suffered heavy losses. The front line simply cannot withstand the attack of German tanks. The troops have already begun to collapse, so let's retreat. A major general and division commander reported to Lieutenant General Boris. It's over. It's over. The entire infantry army was defeated by the Germans in a single encounter. How can we fight this battle? Lieutenant General Boris murmured. His confidence also seemed to be destroyed at this moment. The German army took the initiative to attack with a weak force, but with the cooperation of a large number of technical weapons, it was able to easily defeat the Russian army with absolute superiority in strength. This made the Russian generals who are good at fighting more with less, not knowing how to face it for a while. Under the attack of the German 51st Infantry Division and part of the tanks of the 8th Armored Division, the Russian 22nd Infantry Division collapsed after suffering heavy losses. The frightened Russian army fled in all directions. Some Russian troops who had no hope of escape even surrendered directly to the German army. Chapter 339, Surrender. In the city of Chelm, the fierce naval battle continued. The attack of the 2 German infantry divisions on the Russian army did not slow down because of the transfer of the main force of the 8th Armored Division, but became more violent. Colonel Rommel led the main force to assist the 51st Infantry Division to attack the Russian 22nd Infantry Army. In the city of Chelm, only less than 20 tanks were left to cooperate with the 49th Infantry Division and the 50th Infantry Division. The lack of a large number of tanks has weakened the German army's attack capability, but they are still advancing continuously, squeezing the living space of the Russian army and causing greater casualties to the Russian army. The first squad covers fire, the second squad frontally attacks, and the third squad turns around. A German platoon leader ordered. The platoon belonged to heavy machine guns and mortars, and started shooting. The squad's machine gun also fired immediately, and the dense bullets sent smoke and dust to the Russian barricade at the end of the street. Those Russian soldiers were so suppressed that they couldn't even raise their heads. Boom. A mortar shell hit the barricade of the Russian army. The explosion sounded and killed many Russian soldiers inside. Taking advantage of this opportunity, a squad of German troops launched an attack on the Russian barricade and successfully broke through the barricade. After a brutal hand-to-hand fight, the barricade was occupied by the Germans. With this barricade as the center, the German army began to attack all around, clearing out the surrounding Russian troops. In the city of Chelm, the positions of the Russian army are constantly being lost, and the casualties are also increasing. This made it more difficult for the Russian army to persist in the city. Many Russian soldiers who were injured in the battle had no one to take care of them at all. They could only endure the pain caused by the trauma, and in the midst of howling, they felt their lives passing away little by little. General, our position is lost. The German offensive is too fierce, and we can't stop it at all. Now, there are less than 1,000 people left in my army. A major general and division commander reported with a ras-hen face. The German attack is getting more and more violent, and our troops are retreating steadily. If this continues, we will not be able to withstand the German attack. Soon, the entire Chelm will fall under the Germans' control. In your hand. Lieutenant General Fieder said with red eyes. In the past 2 days, he has hardly rested for a moment. Although, he has tried everything. However, the current battle situation is still very unfavorable to them. For the Russian army, the situation is constantly deteriorating, and he seems to have seen that failure is imminent. Where has the 22nd Army arrived? Why hasn't it arrived yet? Lieutenant General Golovin asked. The 22nd Army, which was ordered to reinforce them, has become their only hope. If the 22nd Army can arrive in time, relying on these new forces, it may be able to barely stop the German attack. Otherwise, the troops currently deployed in the city of Chelm would not be able to withstand the German attack at all. I don't know. I have sent a telegram to inquire, but there is no news at all. Only God knows when that fellow Boris will arrive in Chelm. I hope he will not come to collect the body for us. Lieutenant General Fieder smiled dryly. Damn it. Lieutenant General Golovin couldn't help cursing. They are now like bears trapped in a trap. They have tried their best, but there is still no way. They can only watch the enemy approaching constantly, and eventually lose their lives. At this moment, a staff officer rushed in with a look of panic. Lieutenant General Fieder and Lieutenant General Golovin couldn't help feeling tense after seeing this scene. They knew that there must be some bad news coming. Report. The 22nd Infantry Corps is calling. They were attacked by the German army. The troops suffered heavy losses, and now the whole army has collapsed. The staff officers said. What? How is this possible? Excuse. This must be the excuse made by that guy Boris. The main force of the Germans is still in Chelm. How could they attack them? I will report to General Dmitriev and expose that shameless guy Boris. General Golovin was furious. General, the 22nd Infantry Division reported that they were not only attacked by a large number of German infantry and tanks, but also by a large number of German aircraft. This made the 22nd Infantry Corps collapse. The staff officer continued. A large number of planes and tanks? Could it be that other German troops have taken action? The German 8th Army has more than just such a small number of troops. Lieutenant General Fieder said. Lieutenant General Golovin's face also continued to darken. Regardless of whether the collapse of the 22nd Infantry Corps is true or not, it is very bad news for them. Originally, the 22nd Infantry Army had become their life-saving straw. However, the 22nd Infantry Army was defeated by the Germans before it reached Chelm. This undoubtedly made them lose their reinforcement. If they want to continue in Chelm, they can only rely on their own strength. And that, obviously, is impossible. The sharp attack of the German army has proved that their resistance is so fragile in the face of the powerful attack of the German army. Fieder, what should we do now? Can we continue to persevere? Lieutenant General Golovin asked. Lieutenant General Fieder shook his head. Judging from the attack strength of the Germans, we will be wiped out by them by tomorrow at the latest. No, we can't go on like this. Let's break through. Lieutenant General Golovin suggested. Breakthrough? Lieutenant General Fieder was taken aback. Admiral Dmitriev's order was to ask them to stick to Chelm. If they broke through, it would undoubtedly violate Admiral Dmitriev's order. However, for the sake of his own life, Lieutenant General Fieder still approved this suggestion. In the evening of that day, the remaining Russian troops in Chelm broke out to the south in an attempt to escape from Chelm. But unfortunately, they ran into the German 51st Infantry Division, which defeated the Russian 22nd Infantry Corps and dozens of tanks of the 8th Armored Division. This naturally made the breakout of the Russian army smashed as easily as hitting a stone with a pebble. In the case of heavy losses, the rest of the Russian army had to retreat to Chelm again. The Germans, on the other hand, completed the siege of Chelm. The Russian army inside is hard to fly even with wings. The breakout failed, and an atmosphere of despair spread within the Russian army. Many Russian officers and soldiers do not want to be killed. So, they joined forces and demanded that Lieutenant General Fieder and Golovin surrender to the Germans. Under tremendous pressure, Lieutenant General Fieder and Lieutenant General Golovin had no choice but to adopt this suggestion and send someone to contact the German army about the surrender. Chapter 340, Blitz Lviv. Uzhhorod, Austrian Army Command. The three armies of the Russian Southwest Front Army are still launching a fierce attack on the Austrian defense line. Although, the Austrian army successfully resisted the attack of the Russian army by using fortifications and powerful firepower, and caused great casualties to the Russian army. But at the same time, the casualties of the Austrian army continued to increase. As the casualties increased, the morale of the Austrian army inevitably to decline. The consequence of this is that the defense line of the Austrian army has been in danger several times. There are several defense lines that were almost broken by the Russian army. This made Marshal Herzendorf very nervous, and even had to start splitting and supplementing the 4th Army as a reserve to the front line, to stabilize the defense line. Regarding the performance of the Austrian army, Qin Tian couldn't help shaking his head. Initially, the Austrian army's performance is not bad. But as the casualties appeared, the performance of the troops began to develop in a worse and worse direction. The reason is undoubtedly that the fighting will of the Austrian army is too fragile. In the case of the German army, such a situation is absolutely impossible. However, the Austrian army has been weak for a long time, and Qin Tian has nothing to do about it. He can only hope that the Austrian army can persist until the German army's strategic plan is realized. In that case, they will win this battle. Otherwise, the consequences will be disastrous. Your Excellency, Marshal, is the Russian army's offensive still fierce? Qin Tian asked. Yes, Your Royal Highness. The Russians seem to be crazy, and they continue to launch fierce attacks on our defense line. Our troops are under great pressure. Marshal Herzendorf said with red eyes. He didn't sleep all night last night. Because, at night, the Russian army organized several night raids and almost broke through the Austrian army's defense line. As the chief of staff of the Austrian army, Marshal Herzendorf knew very well how serious the consequences would be if the Austrian army failed to hold on to the line of defense. Therefore, he has been guarding the command post, constantly contacting the front line, knowing that he has personally sent a telegram to the commander of each infantry division, asking them to hold the line of defense no matter what. The losses of the Russians are even greater than ours, and much larger. I think their high-intensity attacks should not last long. If you persist for a few more days, there will be a turning point, Qin Tian said. Marshal Herzendorf nodded. He thought so too. After all, the Russians suffered far more casualties than defending Austrians. Even if it is such a fight for consumption, the Austrian army is more dominant. It is precisely because of this that Marshal Herzendorf took a very rare and severe attitude towards those generals, requiring them to hold the line of defense no matter what, and not to retreat without an order, and those who violated the military law will be punished. It was precisely because of the strong suppression of Marshal Herzendorf that the generals of the Austrian army desperately defended the line of defense. If the performance of the Austrian army on the battlefield before their defense line had already been broken by the Russian army, Your Highness, how is the progress of the German army? Baron Marshal Herzendorf asked. The progress of the 8th Army is still a victory. Our battle at Chelm is about to win. The Russian army tried to send an infantry army to reinforce Chelm, but we were defeated. The Battle of Zamozik has also begun. Yes. There, we also have an absolute advantage. The Russian 4th Army has been completely defeated, which is an irreversible fact. Soon, they will be killed, Qin Tian said quite confidently. Marshal Baron Herzendorf could not help but breathe a sigh of relief when he heard what Qin Tian said. He knew that Qin Tian would not deceive him on these issues. As long as the progress of the German 8th Army goes smoothly, it means that victory is expected. His Royal Highness, don't worry. This time, we will never hold back. Before the German army completes the scheduled battle plan, we will firmly hold the line of defense, and we will never let the Russians break through our line of defense. Baron Marshal Herzendorf said. Your Excellency Marshal, I believe that your army will be able to do it. The Russians will definitely not be your opponents this time, Qin Tian said. Marshal Herzendorf Baron nodded. He seemed very satisfied to be recognized by Qin Tian. Backing to his office, Qin Tian received the battle report from the front line. The Russians actually surrendered? How is this possible? Qin Tian was also very shocked when he learned that the Russian army stationed in Chelm had surrendered to the German 17th Army. After all, although the combat effectiveness of the Russian army is not very good, their will to fight in this war is still very admirable. Perhaps it is because of the hopelessness of victory. Now that the Russian army has surrendered, the combat mission of the 17th Army has undoubtedly been completed ahead of schedule. Your Highness, what should we do next? Brigadier General Manstein asked. Qin Tian's eyes fell on the map hanging on the wall. General Manstein, what's your opinion? Qin Tian asked. Your Highness, I think the 11th Army can be dispatched. Let Colonel Rommel lead the remaining tanks, support the 11th Army, and directly attack Lvov. If we win there, we will surely win the battle. Brigadier General Manstein said. Lvov is the most important strategic node for the defense of the Russian 4th Army, where it is an important material distribution point for the Russian Southwest Front Army. It can be said that 60% of the supplies of the entire Southwest Front Army of the Russian Army arrived here first, and then distributed to the various troops. If the German army can capture Lviv, it means that the Russian Southwest Front Army will face a shortage of supplies. Maybe in less than half a month, the German army and the Austrian army will be able to defeat the Russian Southwest Front Army together. Is the 11th Army ready? Qin Tian asked. Your Highness, these days, the 11th Army has been secretly moving to the front line. For the 11th Army, we have assembled more than 2,000 trucks, including their original transformed trucks. It is enough for the 11th Army to move as fast as possible. They rushed to Lviv as soon as possible. If they are not intercepted by the Russian army, they can arrive in Lviv and launch an attack in just one day, Brigadier General Manstein said. Qin Tian nodded. Although the 11th Army is now more than 100 kilometers away from Lviv, but if the whole crew travels in a truck, it is not a problem to march more than 100 kilometers a day. And after arriving, the soldiers can still devote themselves to the battle with full energy. Well, let General Francois act. Attack Lviv directly. Within 3 days, Lviv must be taken. Qin Tian ordered. Yes, Your Highness. Chapter 341, Scold. Lublin, the temporary headquarters of the German 8th Army. Lieutenant General Ludendorff is talking with Lieutenant General Francois. General Francois, His Highness has issued an order. Early tomorrow morning, the 11th Army will set off from Lublin and make a long-distance attack on Lviv. For this reason, the Legion has specially dispatched 2,000 trucks for you from the rear. At the latest in the morning of the day after tomorrow, the 11th Army must reach Lviv and launch an attack, Lieutenant General Ludendorff said. Yes, Chief of Staff. Lieutenant General Francois replied. Although, it is a very difficult task for any army to attack hundreds of kilometers in one day. However, Lieutenant General Francois is still confident of completing it. Anyway, along the way, all the wheels of the car are on the road. It is undoubtedly much easier for soldiers to march by car than to march with their legs. Although the traffic facilities here are terrible, most of the roads are dirt roads. However, if the truck drives more than 100 kilometers a day, there should be no problem. Colonel Rommel will lead a part of the 8th Armored Division to assist you. The logistics department will supplement Colonel Rommel's troops. At that time, it will recover to more than 100 vehicles. With the assistance of armored troops, attack Lviv. For you, it should not be difficult. Lieutenant General Ludendorff said. Lieutenant General Ludendorff said. Francois nodded. The Russian army in Lviv originally had only 2 infantry corps. And there was also an infantry corps, which was attacked by the 51st Infantry Division of the 17th Army on the way to Chelm, and was defeated and suffered heavy losses. This makes the number of Russian troops in Lviv not much larger than that of the 11th Army. You know, the 11th Army is an infantry army composed of 4 infantry divisions, with a total strength of more than 65,000 soldiers. Among the 3 infantry armies under the 8th Army, their strength has always been the strongest. Chief of Staff, if possible, I hope to get the support of the Air Force. Lieutenant General Francois said. It's no problem, the air team, I will contact you. Lieutenant General Ludendorff said. In that case, there is no problem at all. Lieutenant General Francois nodded. The performance of the 8th Air Force in this war can be described as amazing. Before the war, no one thought that the planes they treated as toys would have such great power. Whether it was the previous bombing of the 9th Russian Army by the 8th Air Force, or the attack by the 8th Air Force on the 4th Russian Army this time, the German generals were amazed. This also makes the generals of the German army all hope that they can get the help of the aircraft of the 8th Air Force during the battle. In this case, their casualties will be greatly reduced. In the early morning of October 10th, the German 11th Army set off from Lublin. The whole army consisted of more than 60,000 people, all of whom took trucks and rushed to Lviv, more than 100 kilometers away. At the same time, part of the 8th Armored Division led by Colonel Rommel also set off from Chelm to Lviv. The main force of the German 17th Army went to Zamość to assist the 20th Army and besiege here. After Zamość's Russian army is eliminated, the main force of the Russian 4th Army can be regarded as eliminated. Lvov, the headquarters of the Russian 4th Army, General Dmitriev is restless, as if something big is about to happen. The current battle situation is really unfavorable for the Russian 4th Army. Unfortunately, Admiral Ivanov hopes that they can persist for more than half a month. However, only 3 days after the battle started, the 4th Army had already lost half of its troops. This made Admiral Dmitriev terrified, and his fear of the German army rose to the extreme. Damn the Germans, how could they be so powerful? Compared with them, our army is completely 2 levels behind. Admiral Dmitriev sighed. Only after really fighting the German army will you know how terrifying the German army is. The 2 guys, Fiedler and Golovin, actually surrendered to the Germans. Where are their backbones? Are they still generals of the Russian Empire? Thinking of Lieutenant Generals Fiedler and Golovin, surrendered to the Germans yesterday. This made Admiral Dmitriev very angry, although he knew that it was a choice made by the 2 of them when they were desperate, and there was no way to do it. However, the surrender of the 2 made General Ivanov very angry. It's just that, in view of the critical juncture of the battle, it has not been dealt with. Once the battle is over, he must be dealt with. If the Russian army wins, it's okay to say that it can make up for it. However, if defeated, the consequences may be very serious. General Boris is here. The adjutant reported to Admiral Dmitriev. Yes. Admiral Dmitriev nodded. General Dmitriev was equally angry at the defeat of Lieutenant General Boris and his 22nd Infantry Corps by the Germans. If they had arrived in time, Chelm might have been able to hold it, and Lieutenant General Fiedler and Lieutenant General Golovin would not have surrendered to the Germans. Everything will never be like it is now. To some extent, the culprit of all this is Lieutenant General Boris. If possible, Admiral Dmitriev would like to kill Lieutenant General Boris immediately. But unfortunately, now he does not have the power to directly shoot a Lieutenant General. Lieutenant General Boris lowered his head after seeing General Dmitriev. He also knew that this time he had made a big mistake. Boris, I sent you to lead the 22nd Army to reinforce Chelm, but what did you do? Admiral Dmitriev roared angrily. General, I don't want this to happen either. The Germans are too powerful. We were flanked by their planes, tanks and heavy artillery. Their attack power far exceeded our expectations. Therefore, the troops were defeated, Lieutenant General Boris explained. Admiral Dmitriev knew that Lieutenant General Boris was telling the truth. Any Russian army would probably collapse in the face of such a situation. However, he couldn't swallow the breath in his heart. Admiral Dmitriev directly scolded Lieutenant General Boris, vented his anger, and then let Lieutenant General Boris go. Moreover, Admiral Dmitriev gave Lieutenant General Boris a chance to make up for his mistakes. Lieutenant General Boris naturally didn't dare to complain. Chapter 342. There is no retreat. Straight, the headquarters of the Russian Southwest Front Army. As the battle situation continues to develop, the situation seems to be becoming more and more unfavorable to the Russian army. This also made the atmosphere of the entire Front Army headquarters more and more tense. Even General Ivanov, the commander of the Front Army, kept his face tense. How is the situation on the front line? Have our troops broken through the defense line of the Austro-Hungarian army? Admiral Ivanov asked. General, the battle is still going on. All our armies are launching fierce attacks. However, the resistance of the Austrian army is also very tenacious. So far, they have not been able to break through the Austrian defense line. The adjutant reported. Damn. Those cowards of the Austro-Hungarian Empire seem to have completely changed their troops. Compared with before, there is a world of difference. Admiral Ivanov sighed. In the early days of the war, the Russian army always had the upper hand in the battle with the Austrian army. However, in this decisive battle, the Austrian army seemed to have been reborn and became alive and well. During the battle, they fought desperately against the Russian army, which made the Russian army unable to break through their defense line for a long time. and the losses are getting bigger and bigger. This made Admiral Ivanov couldn't help expressing concern about the next battle situation. If the Russian army has been unable to break through the Austrian defense line, the 4th Army could not withstand the attack of the German 8th Army, then the battle ended in the defeat of the Russian army. At that time, the Southwest Front Army will suffer a heavy blow. The Russian army will also be at a complete disadvantage on the Eastern Front. Such consequences will not be acceptable to these generals. How is the situation on General Dmitriev's side? Admiral Ivanov asked. General, the situation of the 4th Army is also very bad. General Dmitriev just sent a telegram asking for help, hoping that we will send reinforcement to the 4th Army. Otherwise, they may not be able to last long, the adjutant said. Admiral Ivanov frowned tightly. This battle was really aggrieved. Not only the tenacity of the Austrian army exceeded General Ivanov's expectations, the strength of the German army exceeded his expectations. These two unexpected factors put the Russian army at a disadvantage in this battle. Damn. 300,000 people can't hold out for half a month. Admiral Ivanov couldn't help cursing. General, the German attack was very powerful. The 4th Army suffered heavy losses. Yesterday, the German army captured Chelm. Most of the 100,000 people stationed there were killed. The remaining troops also sent to German people surrendered, including Lieutenant General Fedor and Lieutenant General Golovin. The day before yesterday, the 22nd Infantry Corps went to rescue Chelm, but it was defeated by the Germans before reaching Chelm. The Germans at the same time, it was still storming Zamość, and the troops stationed there by the 4th Army also had difficulty resisting the German attack. Therefore, the situation is very critical, the adjutant explained. General Ivanov remained silent. From the situation reported by the adjutant just now, he also knew that the situation of the 4th Army is indeed very difficult. The main force of the 4th Army was almost completely lost under the onslaught of the German 8th Army. If this continues, the 4th Army may soon be wiped out. Do we have any extra troops? Admiral Ivanov asked. In any case, if the 4th Army really couldn't resist it, it was impossible for him to ignore it, and reinforcement had to be carried out. Whether the 4th Army can withstand the German attack is directly related to whether they have enough time to continue the battle. General, we have no spare troops. All the troops of the 3rd Army, the 8th Army and the 11th Army have been dispatched to attack the Austrian army. The 13th Army is still on the way. At least it will take more than 10 days before we can reach the battlefield, the adjutant said. General Ivanov thought for a while, and then said, send a telegram to General Dmitriev, asking him to persist for at least 10 more days. After the 13th Army, we will directly cooperate with them in combat. General Ivanov has no other choice but to give General Dmitriev and the 4th Army a hope, so that they can muster up the courage to continue fighting. As for whether the 4th Army can persist until the 13th Army arrives, it depends on God's will. Yes, General. The adjutant nodded and went to send a telegram. After the adjutant left, Admiral Ivanov's face darkened. The current situation is really unfavorable to them. He could already faintly feel that they might lose the war this time. The most sensible choice is undoubtedly to shrink the line of defense immediately and stick to it from now on, or retreat to the heart of Russia, trading time through space. However, it is obviously impossible for Admiral Ivanov to do this. If you do that, it means that all the losses that the Russian army has paid before will be in vain. At the same time, it also means that they will be at a disadvantage on the battlefield and lose a large area of territory. Although, this is the only way to reduce losses. But Tsar Nicholas II would never believe it. He would only think that it was the incompetence of the generals that led to the defeat of the Russian army, the loss of a large number of troops, and the loss of a large area of territory. What awaits these generals may be a trial by a military court, and they may even be sent to the gallows by the angry Nicholas II. So, since the battle has already begun, Admiral Ivanov has no way out. Now he has only one choice, and that is to continue the battle until they achieve the final victory, or they lose outright. Of course, there is another reason why Admiral Ivanov chose to continue the battle. That is, there is still a little luck in his heart. In his view, the current situation is not good for the Russian army, but they are not without a chance of winning. If the Russian army can break through the Austrian defense line and defeat the Austrian army, then the situation can be reversed. Otherwise, they will lose this time. May God bless us. Admiral Ivanov secretly prayed to God. Immediately, he once again issued orders to the Russian 3rd Army, 8th Army and 11th Army, asking them to further strengthen their offensive. Within 3 days, the Austrian defense line must be torn apart. Otherwise, they would have no hope in this battle. It can be said that Admiral Ivanov has completely pinned his hopes on the next 3 days of fighting. Chapter 343, Unprepared. At 6 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, the German 11th Army and part of the 8th Armored Division led by Colonel Rommel had arrived less than 5 kilometers away from Lviv. Actually, they arrived last night. However, in order to avoid being noticed by the Russian army in Lviv, they have been staying in a small town 20 kilometers away from Lviv to rest. Before 5 o'clock this morning, the whole army set off again. Colonel Rommel, it seems that we have not been noticed by the Russians. The suddenness of our attack can still be guaranteed. Lieutenant General Francois, commander of the German 11th Army, said with a smile. It could be seen that he was in a very good mood. Although Rommel is just a colonel, Lieutenant General Francois has many major generals and brigadier generals under his command. However, his attitude towards Rommel is much better than that of those generals. On the one hand, of course it was because Rommel was someone Qin Tian valued. On the other hand, it is also because of Rommel's personal talent that Lieutenant General Francois is very optimistic. The performance of the 8th Armored Division in this war is really amazing. So much so that, while these generals were stunned, they all hoped that among their troops, they would have an armored force in the future. In other words, it can be assisted by armored forces in this war. In this case, they will be able to win at a smaller cost. Yes, General. The Russians are unprepared, which is undoubtedly very beneficial to us. It can make them unprepared when we attack. Colonel Rommel nodded. Although Colonel Rommel's military rank is relatively low, as the deputy commander of the 8th Armored Division, he is aware of many important strategic deployments. The importance of attacking Lviv to the German army in this battle is self-evident. Of course, he also hoped that they could take down Lviv in one battle. Order the artillery, deploy it within half an hour, and then launch a fire attack. Don't be stingy with the shells. In the shortest possible time, throw as many shells as possible at Lviv, and kill all the Russians. Admiral Francois ordered. Yes, General. The artillery commander replied. The 11th Army has 4 infantry divisions, so they have more artillery. The artillerymen began to get busy, unfolding the cannons one by one, ready for shelling. The vehicles transporting ammunition are also busy, transporting the truckloads of shells to the artillery positions. Part of the 8th Armored Division led by Colonel Rommel is also preparing for the attack. Originally, after supplementation, the number of their tanks reached more than 100. But driving all the way from Chelm to Lviv, there are only about 80 tanks left that can still be driven. But even so, Colonel Rommel thought it was enough. With these tanks, it was enough to break through the Russian defense line in Lviv and defeat them. According to the information received before the war, the Russian defenders in Lviv only had 70,000 to 80,000 troops. With the strength of the German 11th Infantry Army and the cooperation of some armored units, it is enough to crush them. Fire. At 6:30 in the morning, the German artillery commander gave the order to fire. Immediately, 72 150mm heavy howitzers, 144 105mm light howitzers, and 216 75mm field guns all started fierce shelling. The artillerymen struggled to stuff the shells into the barrel, and then fired them out, smashing these heavy shells at the Russian army. Because Lieutenant General Francois only gave the artillery half an hour to prepare for fire. Therefore, they need to fire as many shells as possible within half an hour. Only in that way can greater results be achieved. When the German attack began, the Russian army in Lviv was still asleep. Although, after the fall of Chelm, the officers and soldiers of the Russian 4th Army knew that Lvov would soon become the target of the German attack. But they all thought that the German army would attack Lviv after capturing Zamosk. But what they never expected was that the German army would directly attack Lviv. In this case, they will undoubtedly be caught off guard. The Russian army in Lviv was not prepared at all. Boom. Boom. When the shells fell from the sky and exploded in the city of Lviv, countless Russian soldiers were awakened from their sleep. There are even some unlucky ones who lost their lives directly in their sleep. More Russian soldiers ran out of the barracks without even having time to put on their clothes and weapons, and scattered to avoid them. It's just that the German bombardment was so violent that the entire Lviv became the target of the German attack. The shells fell like raindrops, and many Russian soldiers were torn to pieces in panic. When the shell exploded, Admiral Dmitriev jumped from the bed. What's going on? Where did the explosion come from? Are the Germans calling? Admiral Dmitriev asked, perhaps not even aware of it himself, and his words were full of panic. General, shelling. This is shelling from outside the city. It should be the Germans. The adjutant reported in panic. What? How is this possible? How could the Germans have come here so quickly? Admiral Dmitriev seemed a little unable to accept this reality. However, the constant explosions in Lviv made him believe that this was the truth. The Germans are shelling Lviv heavily with artillery. It is foreseeable that the German attack will soon begin. The completely unprepared Russian army will inevitably suffer heavy losses under the fierce German shelling. Whether he can withstand the German attack, General Dmitriev has no confidence at all. Order the troops, enter the position immediately, and prepare to resist the German attack. Tell the soldiers, we must resist the German attack, otherwise, everyone will have a dead end. Admiral Dmitriev ordered viciously wrote. Yes, General. In addition, immediately send a telegram to the Front Army Command that we were suddenly attacked by the Germans. The German offensive is very fierce, and we need reinforcement. Admiral Dmitriev said. Although, the German offensive has not yet begun. But Admiral Dmitriev subconsciously thought that the German attack would be strong, so he impatiently began to request reinforcement. But whether he can get reinforcement, he doesn't know. The only thing he knew was that Admiral Ivanov might not have many troops left. Chapter 344. Be sure to hold on. Quick. Enter the position. The Russian officers who received the order began to organize troops to enter the position, preparing to defend against the German attack. Unfortunately, however, the German attack was too sudden. Under the violent shelling of the German army, the Russian army not only suffered a lot of casualties, but the entire army was already in chaos. A large number of Russian soldiers ran around like headless flies, looking for hiding places. Those officers couldn't find their own soldiers at all, let alone organize troops for defense. Boom. 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 The shelling of the German army also continued, and the sound of explosions came and went in the city of Lviv. Although Lviv is a relatively large city, its resident population is only over 100,000. When this place became the most important material distribution center for the Russian Southwest Front Army, the residents living here were forcibly moved out of here. The people stationed in the city are all Russian troops. Boom. Several shells fell on a street one after another, and a row of Russian troops passing through the street caused a catastrophe. Countless Russian soldiers were torn to pieces by shells. The entire street was full of broken limbs and broken arms. The scene was very terrifying, as if it was a sure hell. A 150mm shell hit a 6-story building. A huge hole appeared on the building. Although, this shell failed to blow up the building directly. However, it made the whole building feel crumbling, as if it would collapse at any moment. The shattered masonry hit the street below, causing many Russian soldiers who passed by to be smashed to the ground. A large number of buildings were reduced to ruins under the heavy shelling of the German army. The whole city seemed to be turning into ruins. The defense line of the Russian army outside the city is also the focus of the German attack. Those 75mm field guns, because of their relatively insufficient power and relatively short range, focused on attacking the Russian defense line outside Lviv. Boom. 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 The artillery shells hit the Russian army's positions like raindrops, destroying the fortifications they built bit by bit. The fortifications of the Russian army are still so fragile. Even a 75mm field gun can easily destroy it. Whether it was trenches or firepower points, they were all destroyed under the shelling of the German army. This also made the Russian army's defense line quickly become dilapidated. Of course, the reason for this is that apart from the fact that the Russian army was stealing and playing tricks when building positions, the more important reason is that the Russian army lacks materials for building positions, such as steel bars and cement, and can only use local materials, built with soil and wood, at most adding a little stone to build it. Naturally, such a fortification cannot be expected to have such a strong defense. Driven by the officers, the Russian soldiers who entered the line of defense naturally could not escape the baptism of the fierce German artillery fire. The dense shells falling down often take the lives of a large number of Russian soldiers. Except, no one cares about their lives. The Germans didn't care. They wanted to kill all the Russian troops stationed in Lviv. The Russian army itself doesn't care either. In the eyes of those Russian generals and officers, these soldiers are just tools for consumption. They are simply cannon fodder, no one will care about them. While the bombardment by the German army continued, the fighter planes of the 8th Air Force also arrived as promised. Hundreds of bombers bombed the Russian defense line. Although these bombers carry only 25 kg small bombs, even such bombs still have a devastating ability to strike the Russian defense line. For those fragile human bodies, it goes without saying, each bomber can carry bombs weighing up to 500 kg. In this case, each aircraft can carry 20 bombs. These bombs fell, and the Russian defense line was completely shrouded in smoke and flames. Countless Russian soldiers were killed in the bombing of these bombers. The defense line of the Russian army was also destroyed during the bombing. Oh, God. Some Russian generals who were hiding in a safe place to observe were all stunned by the German attack methods. After fighting for so many years, it was undoubtedly the first time they had seen such a scene. Damn it. The firepower of the Germans is too strong, right? How can our defense line be able to withstand it like this? The generals of the Russian army couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. If you can't defend it, you have to defend it. Lviv is too important to us. The combat materials stored here are related to the life and death of the entire Southwest Front army, and they must not be captured by the Germans. The general has issued a death order. Let us have to resist the German attack. A lieutenant general said. He is Lieutenant General Sheremetev, commander of the 34th Infantry Corps of the Russian army. Order the troops and prepare to enter the position. Once the German attack begins, prepare to resist them. Lieutenant General Sheremetev ordered. Yes, General. The other Russian generals replied one after another. However, it can be clearly seen from their faces how unconfident they are. Especially those generals of the 22nd Infantry Army of the Russian army who had fled back. They were even more timid. Outside the city of Chelm, they had experienced the attack of the German army. The kind of overwhelming attack led by armored forces is simply too terrifying. Even if it sounds now, I still have lingering fears. Not to mention that they will soon face the German attack again, which makes them feel even more frightened. If Admiral Dmitriev hadn't given the order to die, they probably couldn't help turning around and running away again. Story: the headquarters of the Russian Southwest Front Army. Admiral Ivanov was awakened from his sleep. Last night, he fell asleep very late. So, I want to get out of bed this morning. As a result, the hasty knock on the door woke him up, which immediately made Admiral Ivanov feel very bad. What happened? Admiral Ivanov opened the door and asked impatiently. General, something is wrong. Lviv is under heavy attack from the Germans. General Dmitriev, request reinforcement, the adjutant reported. What? Lviv is under attack, how is that possible? Admiral Ivanov's face suddenly changed. On the one hand, he couldn't believe such a fact. On the other hand, he was unwilling to believe this fact. The importance of Lviv is self-evident. If Lviv is captured by the German army, it will be a fatal blow to the Russian Southwest Front. Send a telegram to Dmitriev. Lviv must be defended, and it must not fall into the hands of the Germans. Admiral Ivanov roared. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 345, Onslaught. Did Dmitriev say how many troops the Germans sent to attack Lviv? After the initial panic, Admiral Ivanov gradually calmed down. General, Admiral Dmitriev did not say the specific strength of the German army. However, he said that they were heavily bombarded by the German army and bombed by planes. The adjutant said. Admiral Ivanov frowned tightly. Since the German army dispatched planes to bomb, this also means that the German army's attack on Lviv was not a feint attack, but really wanted to take Lviv down. This is definitely not good news for the Russian army. Once Lvov can't hold it, and is captured by the German army, in this battle, the Russian Southwest Front army could almost end in failure. No matter what, Lviv must not be lost, it must be defended. Tell Dmitriev, no matter what method he uses, he must defend Lviv, Admiral Ivanov said in a deep voice. He knew that the biggest test for the Russian army was coming. Whether the Russian army can win this battle, on whether the 4th Army can hold Lviv. If the 4th Army successfully held Lvov, then they still have the possibility to continue to hold on. If you can't hold it, then Admiral Ivanov will have to consider how to let the Russian army end this battle at the least cost. If you persist in fighting, it will only make the Russian army pay a greater price. Yes, General. However, the 4th Army's troops in Lviv are running out. If the Germans storm Lviv, General Dmitriev and the others may really have a hard time holding on, the adjutant said. General Ivanov nodded. It was a very risky decision to let the 4th Army to resist the attack of the German 8th Army. Originally, General Ivanov thought that with the 300,000 troops of the Russian 4th Army, there might be a little luck. But now, he realized that the attack power of the German army was stronger than they expected. Under such circumstances, how could it be possible to withstand the German attack? How many troops can we use? General Ivanov asked. General, the reserves in our hands have all been used up. Yesterday afternoon, in order to strengthen the attack on the Austrian army, all the reserves have been dispatched. Unless we wait until the 13th Army arrives. Otherwise, there will be no extra troops to mobilize, said the adjutant. Admiral Ivanov suddenly felt a little headache. The defense and tenacity of the Austrian army exceeded his expectations. Even the 3 Russian armies that mainly attacked the Austrian army paid a heavy price, but still failed to make a breakthrough. If you want to reinforce General Dmitriev, you have to draw troops from the front line. The adjutant continued. Lvov, I have to defend. Order the 3rd Caucasus Army of the 3rd Army to withdraw from the battlefield immediately and reinforce Lvov. Tell Dmitriev that this is the only reinforcement I can send him. If he can't hold on anymore, then go and apologize to His Majesty the Tsar. General Ivanov said. Yes, General. The adjutant immediately sent a telegram. Damn Germans, are they really going to drive us out? Admiral Ivanov frowned tightly. The current situation is so unfavorable to them that he is very pessimistic about the next battle situation. On the front line of Lviv, the German attack continues. The bombers of the 8th Air Force have dropped their bombs and left the battlefield. However, those fighter jets were still hovering in the sky like vultures. Once they find the target, they will rush down fiercely and use aviation machine guns to shoot frantically, harvesting the lives of Russian soldiers. General, it's almost time. The adjutant said to Lieutenant General Francois. Lieutenant General Francois nodded. Then start the attack. Colonel Rommel, this time it's up to you. The 32nd Infantry Division and the 33rd Infantry Division, in cooperation with the armored forces, tore through the Russian defense line in one fell swoop. Yes, General. Colonel Rommel and the commanders of the 2 infantry divisions replied. Panzers, attack. Colonel Rommel ordered loudly. More than 80 tanks started to move and rushed to the Russian army's position. 2 infantry divisions, more than 20,000 infantry, followed the tanks and launched an attack. At this moment, the position of the Russian army has become a mess. Under the heavy bombing and shelling of the German army, their defense line seemed to have been plowed several times with a plow. All kinds of fortifications were bombed to pieces. Limbs and arms are flying everywhere. Quick! The Germans are coming. Enter the position to defend. The frontline commander of the Russian army ordered loudly after discovering that the German army was attacking. Get up, you idiot. The Germans are coming. A low-level Russian officer grabbed the clothes of a Russian soldier and shouted loudly. Get up, you scumbags. The Germans are coming. If they break in, we are all dead. The Russian soldiers who survived the heavy shelling and bombing of the German army by chance were driven into the position, just like driving cattle. It's just that when these Russian soldiers saw the German tanks, they couldn't help being scared. Especially those soldiers of the 22nd Infantry Corps of the Russian army. They had experienced a failure in Chelm. After seeing those tanks, the horror in their memories seemed to be awakened again. Got German tanks. Their tanks are coming. We can't resist their tanks at all. A Russian soldier yelled in horror. Fool. Fire me. Da da da. The heavy machine guns on the Russian army's position began to fire, but facing the heavily armored tanks, these machine gun bullets did not pose any threat at all. Heavy machine guns may be a big killer against infantry. However, against tanks, there is no threat at all. Boom. German tanks also began to use tank guns to gradually destroy targets that threatened the infantry. This kind of tactic has been used many times by the German armored forces, and it can be said to be very familiar. Under the attack of the German tanks, the firepower of the Russian army was destroyed one by one. Although, the Russian army is still firing wildly, but it's like it's of no use at all. My god. Come on, the Germans are coming. A German tank was less than 100 meters away from the Russian defense line. Chapter 346, Occupied. Da da da. On the Russian army's position, two Maxim heavy machine guns fired wildly at a German tank. The dense bullets hit the armor of the tank like a torrential rain, making tinkling sounds and sparks flying. However, the tank seemed not to be affected at all, and continued to advance against the firepower of the Russian army. Got. How can our enemies be so powerful? Are they all devils? A Russian soldier was terrified. In their eyes, the one who can't even deal with a heavy machine gun is probably the devil. Haha. These Russians, are they all fools? We have fought them several times. Why do they use machine guns to deal with our tanks every time? Could it be that they thought that with the bullets of the machine guns, they could can't the armor of the tank be penetrated? The tank commander sneered. Who knows? Anyway, our order is to kill these Russians. It doesn't matter whether we kill them with shells, bullets, or treads. As long as these Russians are dead, the task is completed. The driver said indifferently. Indeed, for these armored soldiers who have experienced many battles, their tanks have been replaced several times, which also makes them completely numb to this war. Their weapons have completely become a killing weapon. No enemy can resist the attack of their tanks. At the same time, tanks will also give them the best protection, so that after they go to the battlefield, they can just kill people. That's right, our mission is to kill these Russians. The gunner also said. Then work. Guys, aim at the heavy machine guns of the Russians. Although we are not afraid, the infantry behind us. Get rid of them, and provide protection for the infantry. The commander ordered. Yes, sir. The turret of the tank began to rotate, and soon aimed at the heavy machine gun of the Russian army. When the Russian machine gunner found that the enemy's tank turret was aimed at him, he was scared out of his wits. Just about to run away, but before he could take 2 steps, the explosion sounded. Boom. The heavy machine gun of the Russian army was blown into a pile of parts. The Russian machine gunner was also killed in the explosion. Immediately afterwards, the tank destroyed another heavy machine gun. A safe passage was cleared for the follow-up infantry. Then, the tank continued to move forward. Its tracks ran over the barbed wire fence and deer village of the Russian army, crossed their trenches, and entered the Russian army's position. Da da da. The tanks that broke into the Russian army's positions were like tigers breaking into a flock of sheep, slaughtering these Russian soldiers wantonly. Countless Russian soldiers were killed. A large number of Russian soldiers began to turn around and flee regardless of the chief's obstruction. However, a large part of them were slaughtered by the German machine gun fire. The infantry following the tanks seized this opportunity and broke through the Russian positions, started to provide protection for the tanks, and at the same time, with the assistance of the tanks, cleared the remaining Russian enemies on the position. The German army broke through the Russian defense line outside Lviv with only 1 round of attack. The Russian army suffered heavy losses, and many people were killed by the German army. There are still many Russian troops who directly raised their hands and surrendered to the German army. The rest of the Russian army fled back to the city of Lviv. Good job. Order the ministries to launch an attack on the city of Lviv. Take Lviv in one fell swoop. Lieutenant General Francois ordered. The advance speed of the German army exceeded his expectations. Of course, this is good news, which means that they can annihilate the Russian army here in the shortest possible time and win this battle. Tens of thousands of German troops, led by dozens of tanks, divided into 4 groups, and launched an attack on Lviv. It is impossible for the Russian army, which suffered heavy losses, to resist the German attack. Many Russian soldiers, when they saw the dark tank rushing towards them, threw away their weapons, and ran away without even thinking about resisting. They have all been frightened by the German tanks. Russian 4th Army Command, General Dmitriev is like an ant on a hot pot. The German army is launching a heavy attack on the city, defended by his troops. Although, he thought he had done everything he could. However, he was not sure at all whether he could withstand the German attack. General, Your Excellency, the commander asked us to hold Lvov. He has ordered the 3rd Caucasus Army to reinforce us. The adjutant reported to Admiral Dmitriev. If you stick to it, you have to be able to defend it. The Germans are attacking so violently that our troops can't resist their attack at all. How can we defend? Admiral Dmitriev said, very angry. From the very beginning, when General Ivanov ordered him to hold off the attack of the German 8th Army, he knew it was a hard job. However, only now did he realize that he still seriously underestimated the difficulty of this task. General, the outer defense line has fallen. The Germans have entered the city of Lviv. A staff officer reported to General Dmitriev in panic. How is it possible? It's only been 2 hours since the Germans launched their offensive. Has the outer defense line fallen? Admiral Dmitriev looked shocked. General, the Germans use tanks as the vanguard, and we simply cannot resist the attack of their tanks. The staff officer explained. Bastard. Order the troops in the city to stick to their respective positions. Without my order, you must not retreat. Admiral Dmitriev ordered. Yes, General. The staff officer went to convey the order. It's just that General Dmitriev's order is useless at all. The German army that invaded the city of Lviv continued to attack fiercely, and the resistance of the Russian army, like paper, was easily broken through by them. In the case of continuous failures, the Russian army's will to resist is very weak. In many cases, the Russian army ran away as soon as they saw the German tanks coming. Even, many people raised their hands directly to the German tanks. For the German army, this battle was too easy. The resistance of the Russian army was weak, and it was simply powerless to stop the German army. At 5 p.m., General Dmitriev, the commander of the 4th Front Army of the Russian army, saw that the situation was over, so he had to lead the remnants to break through, and fled in the direction of Stry and Lvov. The most important supply base of the Russian Southwest Front Army fell completely and fell into the hands of the German army. At the same time, there were also mountains of supplies that fell into the hands of the German army. Chapter 347. The odds are on. The jeep of Lieutenant General Francois, commander of the German 11th Army, drove into the city of Lviv. Although there are occasional sporadic gunshots in the city, overall, the German army has controlled the city. Rows of dejected Russian soldiers passed in front of Lieutenant General Francois' car in a neat line. Colonel Rommel, I bet these Russians have formed the most orderly line since they joined the army. Lieutenant General Francois said with a smile. Yes, General. I fully agree with your statement. Colonel Rommel smiled. In just one day, they took Lviv and wiped out tens of thousands of Russian troops. At the same time, on the Zamość battlefield, the German attack also came to an end. This made the German attack on the Russian 4th Army almost over. The more than 300,000 people of the Russian 4th Army, except for a very small number, have been wiped out by the German army. More importantly, they also captured Lvov, the most important supply base of the Russian Southwest Front Army. Without this supply base, the entire Southwest Front Army of the Russian army may not be able to last much longer. Unless their soldiers are hungry, holding rifles without bullets, and fighting fiercely with the German and Austrian allied forces. Otherwise, they can only retreat. However, will the German army let the Russian Southwest Front Army withdraw so easily? How is that possible? This is the best opportunity to beat the dog in the water. If it is possible to eat up all the Russian Southwest Front Army, it can be regarded as eating up the main force of the Russian army. This will bring Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire a considerable period of security on the Eastern Front. Even if Russia has completed its mobilization, it has reorganized a large number of troops. However, after losing the elite troops, it is obviously impossible for those newly formed mobs to pose much threat to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Even, they can easily defeat the Russian army again and win more and greater victories. General, we found a large number of Russian material warehouses. The food, ammunition and other combat materials inside are piled up like mountains. A major general reported to Lieutenant General Francois. When the Russians left, they didn't destroy these supplies. Lieutenant General Francois was shocked. If it were the German army, it would never make such a mistake. After all, even if you can no longer use these materials, you must destroy them so as not to leave them to the enemy. In that case, it is an enemy. Perhaps it was because of the Russian army retreated in a hurry, so they didn't have time to destroy these supplies. The Major General said. Haha, that's great. That's just cheaper for us. Lieutenant General Francois was very excited. Although, the caliber of the Russian cannons is different from that of the German cannons. The Germans could not use these shells. However, in addition to shells, those food and rifle bullets and machine gun bullets are always common, right? The German army can completely use these materials. In this way, the logistical pressure on the German 8th Army can be greatly reduced, which is more conducive to their continued fighting in this war. Notify the headquarters and His Royal Highness the news of our victory. Then, let me see what good things the Russians have left for us. Lieutenant General Francois ordered. Yes, General. A staff officer immediately went to send a telegram. As ordered, Austrian Army Command. Marshal Herzendorf looked very tired. He was already very old, and he was well maintained before, but he didn't think so much. However, the battle continued for several days. Marshal Herzendorf looked much older. Age spots that were not obvious before are now fully visible. It is conceivable how much pressure Marshal Herzendorf is under now. On the front line, the Russian attack continues. Although, the strength of the attack is not as great as before. However, the battle was still very fierce. This also caused the casualties of the Austrian army to increase. The 4th Austrian Army, which serves as a reserve force, has all been transferred to the front line. However, the current front is still stalemate. Although, the casualties of the Russian army were much greater than those of the Austrian army. But under their continuous attacks, the Austrian army began to gradually show its decline. Your Excellency Marshal, although the battle is tense, you should rest well. Otherwise, your body will not be able to take it anymore. Qin Tian said with concern. He's young and it's no big deal to stay up for a few days. But Marshal Herzendorf, Baron, is already in his 60s. His Royal Highness, I'm fine. As long as we can win this battle, even if I collapse, what's the big deal? Baron Marshal Herzendorf looked indifferent. Your Highness, is there any new information from the front line? Marshal Herzendorf asked. The 11th Army of the 8th Army and part of the 8th Armored Division have already started to attack Lvov. It is said that the Russian army in the city is not prepared at all. This battle should be very smooth. Qin Tian said with a smile. That's good. After taking Lviv, we won't be far from winning this battle. Baron Herzendorf smiled all over his face. Your Highness, General Francois has sent a telegram. Brigadier General Manstein reported to Qin Tian with a smile on his face. Is it good news? Qin Tian asked. Yes, Your Highness, that's good news. General Francois and the others have captured Lviv. The main force of the Russian 4th Army has been wiped out. Only a handful of troops have fled Lviv. The large amount of combat materials stored by the Russian army in Lviv has all fallen into our hands. Brigadier General Manstein said. Haha, that's great. I originally thought that the 11th Army would be able to take Lviv tomorrow, but I didn't expect that they would have succeeded today. Qin Tian also had a look of ecstasy. Your Highness, congratulations, you have the most powerful army in Europe and even in the world. Baron Herzendorf had a smile on his face, and at the same time, there was envy in his eyes that could not be concealed. Your Excellency the Marshal, you should congratulate us. The 8th Army has already captured Lviv. Next, it is time for the Russians to be summoned. I think we are not far from winning this time. The only thing that is uncertain now is how large a victory we can achieve. Qin Tian said. Yes, Your Royal Highness. We have already won this battle. Without Lviv and the combat supplies there, the Russians can't last much longer. Marshal Herzendorf was beaming. Chapter 348, Strategic Retreat. Story, the headquarters of the Russian Southwest Front Army. The commander, Admiral Ivanov, is in a rage at the moment. This made all the officers of the entire headquarters silent, for fear of angering Admiral Ivanov, which would lead to unwarranted disasters. The 4th Russian Army was defeated in Lvov. The commander, Admiral Dmitriev, fled Lvov. Less than 10,000 troops were withdrawn. You know, the 4th Army is a huge army with 300,000 troops. But what I never expected was that it was defeated by the Germans in just a few days, and they paid such a heavy loss. General, the 4th Army's battle in Zamosk has also failed. The Germans have occupied Zamosk. A staff officer bit the bullet and reported to General Ivanov. In view of the fact that Admiral Ivanov is in a very bad mood now, these officers do not want to see him unless it is a last resort. I see, you go out. Admiral Ivanov said blankly. Zamosk's defenders were wiped out by the Germans, which is nothing to General Ivanov. In his heart, he had fully accepted the fact that the 4th Army was wiped out. Yes, General. The staff officer hastily retreated, as if he was afraid that General Ivanov would repent. Damn, what should I do next? The Germans are too strong, and the 4th Army is too weak, which led to Lviv being quickly occupied by the German army. Without Lviv, the logistics and combat supplies on the front line cannot be guaranteed. How can we continue this battle? Admiral Ivanov was very angry and flustered at the same time. No, we can't continue the fight. We must retreat. Otherwise, once there is a problem with the supply of materials on the front line, it will cause a devastating blow to the morale of the troops. At that time, if you want to retreat again, it will be too late. Admiral Ivanov thought secretly. Now, he no longer dared to think about winning. He didn't even want to hold on for a moment. Because he knew that every time the time passed, their situation was dangerous. The German army that captured Lviv was like a dagger stuck in their backs, which could be inserted at any time and kill them. However, for Admiral Ivanov, retreating is not so easy. Before the battle began, he almost desperately chose a risky tactic. Now, the final result is that his adventure has completely failed. At the same time, it also caused heavy losses to the Russian Southwest Front Army. With such a result, he has no way to explain to Grand Duke Nicholas and Tsar Nicholas II. God, how could this battle be fought like this? Admiral Ivanov closed his eyes in pain. Originally, the tactic he adopted was a bit risky. However, it is definitely not without a chance of winning. On the contrary, Admiral Ivanov also believes that the odds of winning are relatively high. After all, the Austrian army's vulnerability has been verified by them. However, after the battle began, the tenacity of the Austrian army was completely beyond their expectations. No matter how fierce the Russian army launched a fierce attack, the Austrian army's defense line was still very stable. On the other side, the offensive was very strong, which made the Russian army gradually fall into a disadvantage in this battle. Now, among the 4 armies of the Southwest Front Army, the 4th Army has been wiped out. The 3rd Army, the 8th Army and the 11th Army have lost more than 100,000 troops. This also means that in just a few days of fighting, they lost nearly half of their troops. It is already impossible for the remaining 600,000 to 700,000 people to fight against the German-Austrian coalition forces. We must retreat. Otherwise, all the troops will be damaged here. Admiral Ivanov made up his mind. Immediately, Admiral Ivanov personally drafted a telegram and sent it to the Russian Army Front Command, requesting the Russian Army Commander-in-Chief Grand Duke Nicholas to retreat. Grand Duke Nicholas is also paying attention to the development of the battle situation. After all, when the Northwest Front Army was wiped out and had not had time to rebuild, the decisive battle between the Southwest Front Army and the German-Austrian allied forces was directly related to the victory or defeat of the entire Eastern Front. When Admiral Ivanov chose aggressive tactics, Grand Duke Nicholas did not stop him. Because he also hopes that the Russian army can win this battle. But it is a pity that the *** of luck did not favor them in the end. The Southwest Front Army with millions of Russian troops is already in a desperate situation in this battle. How could this battle be fought like this? Could it be that the military strength of the Russian Empire is really so far behind the mainstream of the world? Grand Duke Nicholas had a bitter face. Although, the combat effectiveness of the Russian army has always been at the bottom among the great powers. However, relying on their huge military superiority, they can still maintain their status as one of the great powers. The title of steamroller made European countries even more frightened. But now, when the superiority of troops can no longer determine the outcome of the battlefield, the Russian army has lost its greatest advantage. Grand Duke Nicholas knew that after this battle, the Russian army would be at a serious disadvantage on the Eastern Front. I'm afraid that until the end of this war, they will not be able to recover their disadvantages. As for whether Russia can win the final victory in this war, Grand Duke Nicholas has no hope anyway. It's not that they are too weak, but because the enemy is too strong. General, Admiral Ivanov requests a retreat. A telegram from a general to Admiral Ivanov was handed over to Grand Duke Nicholas. Grand Duke Nicholas nodded after reading it. We have already lost this battle, and it is meaningless to continue fighting. It will only make us pay a higher price. Tell General Ivanov, I allow them to retreat. Temporary failure is nothing. We have not lost to the point of complete defeat. We still have a chance. Bring as many troops back as possible. That will be the seeds of our resurgence. Yes, General. The general nodded. When the telegram from Grand Duke Nicholas was delivered to Admiral Ivanov, he immediately issued an order to retreat. Admiral Ivanov ordered the Russian 3rd Army, 8th Army, and 11th Army to immediately break away from contact with the Austrian army and retreat quickly. Retreat all the way to the hinterland of Ukraine and Belarus, and give up a large area of territory in exchange for them getting rid of the pursuit of the German-Austrian coalition forces. Chapter 349. Attack across the board. General, Your Excellency Commander's order to retreat has been issued, and we are required to retreat overnight tonight. The commander and staff officer of the Russian Third Front reported to General Ruski. Okay, order the troops and start preparations. After 2 hours, the whole army will retreat. Admiral Ruski nodded with a dark face. The Third Army also suffered heavy losses in this battle. In the battle against the Austrian defenses, they lost more than 100,000 people. When Lvov was attacked by the Germans, Admiral Ivanov ordered the 3rd Caucasus Army under the 3rd Army to be transferred to reinforce Lviv, so that the troops under the 3rd Army now numbered just over 100,000. How did the cowards of the Austro-Hungarian Empire become so powerful? It's incredible. Admiral Ruski couldn't figure it out. Why overnight, the combat effectiveness of the Austrian army has undergone a radical change. Otherwise, how could the Austrian army, who were easily defeated by them before, be able to fight to the death in the face of their powerful attacks? However, even if you don't want to believe it, the fact is the fact, which cannot be changed. The Russian army has failed in this attack. After Lviv was captured by the German army, they were even more mortally threatened. Therefore, we can only retreat. Otherwise, the last hundreds of thousands of troops may also be lost here. 2 hours later, the remaining hundreds of thousands of troops of the Russian Third Army withdrew from the battlefield and fled to the east. At the same time, the Russian 8th Army and the 11th Army are doing the same thing. Having suffered heavy losses, after receiving the order from Admiral Ivanov, they directly organized their troops to retreat without stopping. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops retreated overnight. In this regard, the Austrian army confronting the Russian army did not know. It was Qin Tian who mentioned this when he was talking with Marshal Herzendorf. Your Excellency Marshal, the 8th Army has completed the scheduled combat mission. However, in order to prevent the Russian army from fleeing, tomorrow morning, the main force of the 8th Army will continue to attack south, seize more important node cities, and block the Russian army. The way to escape. However, the 8th Army has limited strength, so it is very difficult to say how many Russian troops can be blocked. Qin Tian said. His Royal Highness, the 8th Army was able to wipe out a group army of the Russian army in such a short period of time. It also captured an important logistics base of the Russian army. This is already extremely difficult. If it were the Austrian army, any group army, it is impossible. In this battle, we have wiped out half of the Russian Southwest Front army. This is already a rare victory. Next, no matter how many Russian troops are eliminated, we have already won. If it would be great to be able to eliminate more Russian troops, Marshal Herzendorf said with a smile. Indeed, for the Austrian army, this battle is already an extremely rare victory. Even if this battle ends like this, Marshal Herzendorf is already very satisfied. However, what Qin Tian wanted was not just such a victory. In this battle, Qin Tian is preparing to wipe out the main force of the Russian army in one fell swoop and completely gain the absolute advantage on the Eastern Front. Therefore, he hopes to eliminate the troops of the Russian Southwest Front Army as much as possible. Compared with the troops being formed in Russia, the troops of the Russian Southwest Front Army, which has experienced the baptism of war, are undoubtedly more powerful in combat effectiveness. After solving them, the strength of the Russian army will drop to a higher level. This will be very beneficial to both Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Your Excellency, Marshal, we still need to eliminate as many Russian troops as possible. Therefore, once the Russian troops retreat, I hope that the Austrian troops will pursue them with all their strength. Only in this way will we be able to maintain our long-term advantage on the Eastern Front. Don't forget, the mobilization of the Russians is almost complete. At that time, they can easily send another 2 million or more troops to the front. Therefore, we must seize this opportunity to mobilize the Russians in one fell swoop. Get down, Qin Tian said solemnly. A trace of hesitation flashed in the eyes of Marshal Herzendorf. The loss of the Austrian army in this battle was close to 200,000. This is undoubtedly a heavy loss for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If they continue to pursue the Russian army, it will inevitably cause them to pay greater losses. However, he had to admit that what Qin Tian said was very reasonable. This is an excellent opportunity for them to severely damage the Russian army and consolidate their advantages on the Eastern Front. If you give up this opportunity, you don't know when you will have such an opportunity in the future. Although the troops are now suffering heavy losses, the mobilization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire will soon be completed. Lost troops can be quickly replenished. It is even possible to form new troops to bring their military strength to a higher level. In this case, this opportunity to severely damage the Russian army cannot be let go. Okay, Your Royal Highness. Tomorrow morning, I will send a force to launch a tentative attack. If the Russians do not resist, the Austrian army will attack across the board, striving to achieve the greatest results in this battle. Baron Herzendorf said. Yes. Qin Tian nodded. It would be the best if the Austrian army could attack across the board and pursue the Russian army. This can further expand their results and cause greater losses to the Russian army. Useful for the next battle. Of course, it would be great if the domestic situation in Russia could be changed accordingly. This is really great news for Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the morning of October 12th, Marshal Herzendorf ordered the Austrian 2nd Army and 3rd Army to send an infantry division each to attack the Russian positions. When the officers and soldiers of the 2 infantry divisions of the Austrian army launched an attack tremblingly, thinking that the vicious Russians were about to rush out and wipe them out, what they couldn't believe happened. On the Russian position, it was quiet and there was no movement at all. When these Austrian soldiers plucked up their courage and rushed to the Russian army's position, they realized that there was no one in the entire position. There are scattered weapons and ammunition everywhere. Obviously, the Russian army was in a hurry when they withdrew. After hearing the news, Marshal Herzendorf was even more surprised. He immediately issued an order, asking the Austrian 2nd Army, 3rd Army and 4th Army to attack across the board and chase the fleeing Russians! Exclamation mark. Chapter 350, Big Rout. Order all the troops to attack me quickly. Those despicable and shameless Russians must not be allowed to escape. They are so shameless that they escaped overnight. It is simply a cowardly act. Bo, the commander of the 2nd Austrian Army, General Muelmli, gave the order to pursue in a high-spirited manner. The more than 200,000 troops under the 2nd Army began to chase the Russian army as if they had been injected with chicken blood. In the past, they were kicked out by the Russians, but they didn't expect that the feng shui would turn, and they would have such a chance. These generals of the Austrian army also want to make contributions. Therefore, they are not willing to miss this golden opportunity. The Austrian 3rd Army and 4th Army also started to pursue the Russian army. For a time, the morale of the more than 700,000 Austrian troops was greatly boosted, and the Russian army launched a pursuit in the direction where they fled. At the same time, the 8th Army of the German army also dispatched some troops to go south from Lvov to seize important towns along the route and prepare to stop the Russian army. Although the number of retreating Russian troops amounted to more than 600,000, which was several times that of the German 8th Army, it is almost impossible to keep all these retreating Russian troops. Their combat mission is also to annihilate as many Russian troops as possible. On the road from the east of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Russia, groups of Russian troops are marching. These Russian soldiers were dejected one by one, like a defeated rooster. Although Russia's military power is not the strongest among the great powers, apart from numerical superiority, the Russian army has almost nothing to show for it. Especially the Cossack cavalry, which was famous in Europe in the past, has also been greatly challenged with the large number of automatic firepower equipped troops. But even so, the Russian army managed to regain its confidence in the battle against the Austrian army. Facing the Austrian army, which was much better equipped than them, they were still able to beat the **** out of the opponent. This made the officers and soldiers of the Russian army, when enjoying the fruits of victory, not forget to ridicule the Austro-Hungarian army, as if they were cowards. But now, everything has changed. They fled like stray dogs, and the Austro-Hungarian army turned into vicious pursuers. General, the Austro-Hungarian army has already begun to pursue. Although, we are still far away. However, if our speed slows down, they will soon catch up. Especially since we are running out of supplies. Next, once the soldiers do not have enough food, the consequences will be very serious. A general reported to General Ivanov. Admiral Ivanov's face was gloomy. He knew that what the other party said was true. But, now he has no other way. In this battle, they have already lost, and they lost badly. Now their biggest goal is to bring back as many troops as possible. But unfortunately, the German-Austrian coalition forces will not let them withdraw easily. Even Admiral Ivanov didn't know how many Russian soldiers would successfully escape after the battle. But he knew that this number would definitely not be too large. Order the troops to speed up as much as possible. If there is not enough food, then find a way to collect it on the spot. Admiral Ivanov ordered. General, when we were in the territory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we might not have any problems collecting food on the spot, but if we enter our territory, will we also do the same? The general was a little unsure. Admiral Ivanov hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course, Ukrainian enthusiasts, there is no need to be polite to them. If they donate food obediently, that's all. If they dare to hide, then don't be polite to them. The Russian Empire is also a multi-ethnic country. However, the Russian ethnic group has absolute leadership and their population is the largest. This makes other nations inevitably oppressed by them. Especially Ukrainians, they have fertile land, but because of the exploitation of the Russian government, they can't even eat enough. Famines and the like are even more common. Yes, General, I see. The retreat of the Russian army was not smooth. First of all, after losing Lviv, their logistical supplies encountered great difficulties. Not only is it difficult to replenish weapons and ammunition, but even food is not enough. Secondly, the pursuit and interception of them by the German-Austrian coalition forced the Russian army to speed up as much as possible. Otherwise, there is no escape. In the end, the German 8th Air Force bombed the retreating Russian army, just as it had dealt with the Russian 9th Army in the Kingdom of Poland. A dozen bombers flew over a group of retreating Russian troops. Hundreds of bombs fell along the road. Boom. 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 Intensive explosions sounded, and suddenly, this highway has become a road of death. There were stumps, and broken arms everywhere, and blood even stained the road red. Countless Russian troops were killed. The rest of the Russian army fled the road in a panic, watching the German planes appearing in the sky in horror. Da. Several German fighter jets began to strafe the Russian troops on the ground, and the bullets from the aviation machine guns easily tore these Russian soldiers into pieces. Got. Shoot down the German plane. A Russian officer shouted loudly. However, in the next second, he was hit by a bullet from the fighter jet's aviation machine gun. The whole person, under the intensive machine gun bullets, turned into a pile of minced meat. The airstrike of the German 8th Air Force not only caused huge casualties to the Russian army, at the same time, it also seriously delayed the marching speed of the Russian army, creating opportunities for the pursuit and interception of the German and Austrian allied forces. Under this attack method of the German-Austrian coalition forces, many Russian troops directly collapsed. Countless Russian soldiers were desperately fleeing to the east. They no longer cared about the queues and establishments. Everyone has only one goal, and that is to escape as quickly as possible. The farther the better. Otherwise, you will lose your life. When more and more Russian troops collapsed, it eventually led to a chain reaction. A large number of Russian troops collapsed under the attack of the German-Austrian coalition forces. After more and more Russian troops were affected, it directly led to a major defeat of the Russian army. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops crowded the road leading to Russia, desperately fleeing. However, as their supplies ran out, these Russian troops had to slow down in order to gather supplies. The Austrian army chasing them took advantage of this opportunity to catch up. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.